Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's equal parts glittering and grotesque, something buried behind the velvet curtains of palaces and tucked deep inside marble tombs. This story has castles, crowns, crushed dynasties, and chromosomal mistakes. Yeah, we're talking about royal inbreeding, and let's be real, you probably won't survive this, not because it's scary, but because by the time we're done, your brain may genuinely need a long nap and a DNA test. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing how far this little bedtime campfire reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin, unsurprisingly, with a wedding. But not a wedding in the usual sense. No champagne fountains, no awkward conga lines. This wedding is centuries old, arranged not for love, but for legacy. The bride is a princess, the groom her cousin. They've been raised in separate wings of the same palace, attending different tutors, crossing paths only occasionally. Yet tonight they'll merge their futures, and more importantly, according to their advisors, their bloodlines. For thousands of years, royal families have obsessed over the purity of their blood. In their minds, the right mix of noble heritage could forge an unshakable empire. But here's where things get tricky. When you're trying to preserve power and avoid outsiders, you run out of marriage options real fast. Eventually, your royal pool becomes more of a royal puddle. And guess who gets to swim in it? That's right, you. Let's rewind a bit. Picture a map of Europe in the Middle Ages. Bright banners flap over hilltop fortresses. Every little kingdom has its own court, crest, and a collection of children meant to be married off like chess pieces. Royal kids are born with titles like Duke of Here or Princess of There, but their real job is to secure alliances. A peace treaty can be signed with a quill, sure, but it's way more permanent when it's sealed with a wedding and a baby. So if you're a king, you might look around at your court, tally up your siblings, your cousins, your nieces and nephews, and ask, which of you is ready to marry your relative for the good of the realm? And someone, uncomfortably young, will probably say yes. In the beginning, these marriages seem strategic. You're a king trying to unite two enemy nations? Marry your daughter to the other king's son. Done. You're a queen trying to prevent war after your husband dies? Marry your cousin and keep the bloodline intact. Simple. But once this becomes habit, generation after generation, the results start to show, and not in a good way. You start seeing more royals with limp limbs, cloudy minds, and underbites so prominent, they become family trademarks. You see children who die young, others who grow up into kings with no heirs, and queens who can't bear children at all. You see entire empires riding on the health of one teenager's bloodstream. One of the most powerful dynasties in history, the Habsburgs, literally wore their inbreeding like a badge of honour. The famous Habsburg jaw, that overseas jutting chin, wasn't just a genetic fluke. It was the result of centuries of marrying relatives to keep their power centralised. You'll meet them soon. Trust me, you'll recognise them when they show up. Here's the quirky part. In ancient times, this kind of inbreeding wasn't always taboo. In fact, it was sometimes encouraged. Royalty, especially in ancient Egypt, believed they were descendants of gods. And gods, by their very nature, didn't need to marry outsiders. So if you were the pharaoh and your sister was available, well, that wasn't considered weird. It was divine. But more on that in the next chapter. You might be asking yourself, didn't anyone realise this was a terrible idea? The short answer is yes, but not until much later. Back then, people didn't understand recessive genes or DNA mutations. They saw a deformed child and blamed the mother, or divine punishment, or even bad astrology. No one thought, hey, maybe we shouldn't marry our first cousins every generation. And the funny, not funny, haha, but funny tragic thing is that even when the results of inbreeding became obvious, many royal families still did it. Because power was a better motivator than fear, and they weren't about to let a little thing like future generations slowly unravelling get in the way of a good political alliance. Of course, some families got away with it for longer than others. There are records of monarchs with multiple overlapping cousin marriages who still lived to be 80 and ruled with clarity. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. For most, this ancient gamble eventually led to dynasties that couldn't sustain themselves. A single genetically compromised heir could bring everything down. And here's the scholarly twist. Some historians argue that the whole inbreeding ruined them narrative is a little too neat. They say other factors, like political missteps, revolutions, wars, were just as damaging. Maybe inbreeding made things worse but didn't cause the fall. Maybe it was more of a perfect storm. Still, it's hard to ignore how many royal lines collapsed after a few too many cousin weddings. So tonight, you'll follow this tangled thread of genetics and monarchy through marble halls and gold-gilded cribs, over Persian carpets and down spiral staircases, past thrones and tombs and secret bedrooms. You'll meet kings who couldn't speak, queens who never smiled, princes who bled from the slightest scratch, and empires that fell, not by sword but by bloodline. And it all starts here, with the simple idea that royalty should only marry royalty, that their blood was not just blue, but better, smarter, stronger, chosen. Spoiler, it wasn't. You glide backward through time and across continents, slipping into the dry, echoing corridors of ancient Egypt. Here, the heat doesn't just press against your skin, it seems to pulse from the stones themselves, as if the sun has been captured inside the architecture. Golden statues stare down with blank eternal eyes. Incense coils lazily in the air, trailing from the altars of gods who look suspiciously like the people ruling the place. And then you see it, the most divine union of all. Pharaoh and sister, husband and wife, ruler and mirror. In this world, marrying your sibling isn't taboo, it's theology. If you're born into the royal house of Egypt, you're not just noble, you're descended from gods. That's not a metaphor. The ancient Egyptians believed their pharaohs were the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship, and the son of Osiris and Isis. And if the gods kept it in the family, well, why shouldn't you? So imagine yourself as a princess in the 18th dynasty. You're groomed not for a foreign prince or a distant cousin, but for your own brother. You walk the palace garden beside him, veiled in silks and gold, discussing offerings to the gods and the ideal time of year to conceive a divine heir. You're not just maintaining power, you're replicating the sacred pattern laid out by the gods themselves, and the kingdom applauds you for it. Take Akhenaten and Nefertiti, for instance. Though modern scholars still debate whether Nefertiti was his cousin, sister, or unrelated entirely, it's clear the practice of marrying within the immediate royal family was entrenched. Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, even married one of his own daughters later in life. That wasn't a scandal, it was continuity. One royal body divided into many roles: father, brother, husband, god. But the real showstopper of royal inbreeding in Egypt is Tutankhamun. King Tut, the teenage pharaoh whose tomb set the modern world on fire with gold and curses, was the literal product of a sibling union. Genetic analysis of his mummy, yes, they ran DNA tests on him, revealed his parents were full brother and sister. That means Tut didn't just wear the crown, he wore the consequences of divine obsession. You approach his chamber now. He's barely 19, but his body tells a different story. Clubfoot, a cleft palate, a curved spine. You notice how the royal artist tried to flatter his features, but the skeleton underneath is hard to deny. The boy king may have ruled over a mighty civilization, but he likely walked with difficulty and pain. There's even speculation that he relied on canes and may have suffered from multiple inherited disorders, the glory of Egypt's god-kings, propped up by walking sticks and prayers. And here's your quirky sidebar. King Tut was buried with over 130 walking sticks. Either he was a collector, or he really needed them. Some had worn tips, indicating regular use, not just symbolic status props. Imagine the golden boy of Egypt limping into ceremonial halls, leaning heavily on a cane while being hailed as the living god on earth. You have to wonder if the irony occurred to anyone. Even then, Egypt's obsession with royal purity wasn't just about appearances, it was about divine legitimacy. Outsiders weren't just culturally suspect, they were cosmically unclean. Marrying someone of non-royal or even non-divine lineage could delegitimize your right to rule, and so, generation after generation, the pharaohs folded their family treason on themselves, chasing godhood at the cost of human health. But here's the thing, historians still argue over how widespread this actually was. Some think sibling marriages were mostly symbolic, more title than practice, with actual romantic unions happening elsewhere. Others argue it was as literal and biological as it sounds. The records are patchy, the artwork stylized. Was Nefertiti Akhenaten's sister, cousin, or just politically convenient? The tombs don't give clear answers, the DNA tests help, but even they can't settle every debate. Still, the pattern's hard to ignore. Royal Egyptian lineage loops in tight circles, sister-mother queens, uncle husbands, cousin fathers. It's a genealogy that reads more like a crossword puzzle than a family tree. And unlike in Europe, inbreeding would eventually cause scandal and suspicion, here it remained sacred, celebrated, holy. But you start to feel the weight of it, not just the spiritual symbolism, but the real toll, on bodies, on minds, on the genetic code stretched thin like gold leaf over wood. Egypt's dynastic ambition didn't just build pyramids, it built fragile heirs. Divine, yes, but vulnerable too. And while the average Egyptian peasant might live a full life tending crops and praying to gods, their god-king might die in his teens, alone in a golden tomb the size of a small village, encased forever in resin and curses. It's a trade-off. Divine lineage for mortal fragility. As you leave Egypt behind, the desert heat still clinging to your skin, and you can't help but marvel. Not at the grandeur or the wealth, but at how far humans will go to protect an idea. The idea that their blood, their family, their claim to power is something sacred, something worth bending nature for, worth risking everything, even the future of the dynasty itself. Because when you trace history's grandest empires backward, following the gilded veins of power, you often find not a tree, but a circle, a loop, overlapping names, shared ancestors, familiar diseases. It's not just Egypt. You'll see it again and again and again. You find yourself standing inside a tomb, not the grand golden cavern of a pharaoh, but something more sterile, more scientific. There's a soft hum of refrigeration in the air, and the glint of stainless steel under fluorescent lights. Here, in this climate-controlled chamber, lies the preserved legacy of Egypt's most famous child king. Tutankhamun, Tut to his friends, if he had any, is stretched out under layers of linen and time. His face, now shrunken and dark, stares up blankly. But you're not really here for his charisma. You're here to examine the blueprint of royal inbreeding in the flesh. It's kind of poetic, really. The boy who once ruled the world's most mythic empire is now the subject of medical papers and DNA studies. In 2010, a team of scientists ran a full genomic analysis on Tut and his family. And when the results came in, it wasn't just dusty scholars who sat up straight. Turns out the rumours were true. Tut's parents weren't just related, they were full siblings, brother and sister. No degrees of separation, no awkward family dinners with extended relatives. Just two children of Akhenaten, determined to keep their divine bloodline undiluted and oblivious to the consequences. Now you might expect that a child born of siblings would carry some genetic baggage. And oh boy did Tut deliver. His skeleton revealed a laundry list of problems: a cleft palate, a curved spine, possibly scoliosis, a deformed left foot with missing bones. No wonder he was buried with over 100 canes, he needed them. Some experts believe he had a clubfoot that made walking painful or even impossible without assistance. He wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead who happened to limp. He was physically compromised from birth, a real-life case study in what happens when a family tree folds inward. But here's where things get interesting. Some of Tut's apparent deformities might have been overblown. When CT scans of his mummy were released, they sparked as much confusion as clarity. One scholar insisted he had a condition called Kohler disease, a rare bone disorder. Another said no, it was sickle cell anemia. Others blamed Marfan syndrome, epilepsy, or just the effects of embalming gone wrong. The list grew like royal rumours. Plausible but murky, almost mythic in itself, the debate still isn't settled. Even with modern tools and thousands of years to think it over, we're not entirely sure what killed him or what was wrong with him. But there is one detail everyone agrees on: he wasn't exactly bursting with vitality. His death around age 19 left no heirs. His wife, who was also his half-sister by the way, had 2 stillborn daughters, their tiny mummified bodies buried with their father. So not only did Tut's parents double down on sibling marriage, but the next generation paid for it again. One of those infants had visible skeletal deformities of her own. You can almost hear the dynasty's genetics sputtering, coughing and going silent. The line ends not with a war or assassination, but with miscarriage and bone disease. And now for something on the weirder side. When researchers opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, they found strange oils used in his embalming. These oils had chemically reacted with his linen wrappings and his flesh, basically cooking his body over time, slow roasting it to a dark, shriveled crisp. The result? A mummy so blackened and contorted that early explorers thought it had been set on fire. which, to be fair, is kind of what happened. A slow, oily funeral barbecue for the most famous teenager in history. The symbolism writes itself. And still he is remembered. Not for his policies or battles, because he had neither, but for the spectacle of his burial, the glimmer of gold and the quiet horror beneath it. His tomb was small by pharaonic standards, possibly rushed, probably second-hand, yet the treasures inside told a story of wealth and ambition, of a boy king meant to inspire awe, even in death. But what they didn't speak of, at least not loudly, was the tragic, increasingly fragile dynasty that placed him on the throne in the first place. You wonder what it felt like to be him, raised from birth to believe he was divine, pampered, isolated, perhaps pitied behind palace doors. Did he ever suspect he was different? Did he notice the whispering servants, the concerned glances from physicians, the way he was always being held up and helped along? Did he ever wish to run, to dance, to be just a boy rather than a god with broken feet? That's the real heartbreak in Tut's story, not the gold, not the treasure hunters or the curses, but the silence. The silence of a dynasty so obsessed with preserving divine blood that it ignored the very real cost in flesh and bone. And you realise that this is just the first of many such stories. Tutankhamun is the prototype, not the outlier. His tale is a preview, a soft introduction to a pattern that will repeat itself with alarming frequency. Because when kings and queens start marrying their own, the results aren't always immediately disastrous. Sometimes it takes generations for the cracks to show, but eventually the foundation buckles. So you leave the refrigerated tomb behind. The DNA report's still open, the debate's still unresolved. Was it inbreeding that killed him? Maybe. Was it malaria? Could be. A broken leg that got infected? Also on the table. The truth is slippery, buried under centuries of embalming oil and political spin. But one thing remains certain. Tut was a child of a closed loop, a dynasty eating its own tail. And he paid the price, even in death, for a family that couldn't bear to open its windows. As you drift away from the Nile Valley, the sun fading behind pyramids and papyrus, you realise this story is just warming up. Because if Egypt was the first to crown inbreeding as divine, Europe was about to crown it as destiny. The moment you cross into Europe, the air shifts. The gold of Egypt fades into cold stone and crisp mountain breezes, and now you're in a world of heraldry, crests and damp castles echoing with the sounds of courtly politics and poorly thought out family decisions. You arrive in Austria, deep in the heart of Habsburg territory, where one of the most powerful families in European history is about to show you what centuries of strategic cousin swapping can really do. If Tutankhamun was a warning shot, the Habsburgs are the full fireworks display. You stand outside a grand palace, one of many the Habsburgs built, filled with tapestries and chandeliers and more portraits of relatives than any normal human could keep straight. And those portraits, let's just say they all share some suspicious features: elongated faces, drooping eyelids, and most famously, a lower jaw that looks like it's trying to escape the rest of the face. You're meeting the infamous Habsburg jaw, the physical embodiment of a family tree that should have had more branches. The jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism, isn't just a cosmetic quirk. It caused speech issues, chewing problems, and likely chronic discomfort. But more than that, it was a visible signal of just how tightly this family had clung to the idea of dynastic purity. Instead of marrying into unrelated noble houses, the Habsburgs repeatedly chose spouses from within the same short list of eligible relatives. First cousins, double cousins, sometimes uncles and nieces. They weren't just intermarrying, they were folding reality in on itself like a noble version of a Mobius strip. You look back through the generations, and the pattern becomes alarmingly clear. By the time Charles II, Sind of Spain, is born, the most tragic example of the Habsburg experiment gone wrong, he has more ancestral overlap than a lab mouse bred for one specific trait. But more on him soon. For now, you're lingering in the late Middle Ages, watching as the Habsburgs consolidate power by keeping it all in the family. Literally. Here's a fun fact, or horrifying depending on your sense of humour. By the 16th century, the Habsburgs were so intermarried that genealogists say their family tree had more loops than branches. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and one of the dynasty's greatest rulers, had a family tree where his grandparents were also his great-uncles and aunts. It's less of a tree and more of a tangled shrub. You would need a whiteboard, a laser pointer, and maybe some aspirin just to trace his ancestry. And still, this wasn't considered madness. It was considered smart, strategic, pure. The belief was that by limiting marriages to within royal and noble circles, especially their own, they could maintain a bloodline blessed by God, untainted by peasant origins or rival claims. It didn't matter that the risks were quietly accumulating in the genetic background like a time bomb. Power was immediate. Future health? That was somebody else's problem. This idea wasn't unique to the Habsburgs, but they took it to new heights, or depths, depending on your angle. Over the centuries, their territories expanded not just through war, but through wedding. They collected thrones like Pokemon: Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, Spain. One royal marriage could result in an entirely new kingdom added to the family collection. Let others wage war, one Habsburg famously said. You, lucky Austria, marry. And marry they did, just not outside the gene pool. Even the children who seemed to escape the effects of inbreeding, those who ruled capably, lived relatively long lives, were still passing along increasingly tangled DNA. The Habsburg jaw didn't pop up overnight. It developed gradually over generations, becoming more pronounced with each familial marriage. One study analysed 15 Habsburg portraits and found that the severity of the jaw correlated directly with the level of inbreeding, which is both hilarious and tragic when you realise the best record of this dynasty's genetic misadventures might be in their own official artwork. But here's the scholarly twist. Not everyone agrees that the jaw was purely genetic. Some argue it was exaggerated by court painters, made to look more noble or distinguished. Others say it was more cultural than hereditary, caused or worsened by environmental factors or disease. Still, the science seems to back the idea that at least part of the Habsburg signature look was thanks to cousin marriage, and lots of it. And yet, for all this, the Habsburgs thrived for a time. They dominated European politics, commanded vast armies, and sat on more thrones than any other family in history. But eventually, the consequences of their genetic corner-cutting would catch up with them. It wasn't just the jawline, it was fertility issues, mental decline, physical disabilities, a slow decay that by the time it reached Spain would become undeniable. So as you stand here, watching a court banquet unfold in a hall lined with ancestral portraits that all somehow resemble each other just a little too closely, you start to see the pattern. The Habsburgs didn't think of themselves as fragile. They thought of themselves as eternal, as chosen. Their portraits weren't just art, they were propaganda, affirmations of divine continuity. And if that meant marrying someone you shared a grandmother with, so be it. The crown was more important than common sense. The air in the palace feels stale, generations of closed windows, both literal and metaphorical. The bloodlines are tight, the ambition tighter, but you know it can't last, that beneath the polished marble floors and golden tapestries lies a truth no amount of pageantry can hide. Nature doesn't care about your titles, it doesn't care about your lineage or your divine right. It only cares about the math of genes, and the Habsburgs were working with increasingly limited variables. You begin to sense a kind of creeping inevitability. The same way Tutankhamun's brittle body hinted at a lineage stretched too thin, the Habsburgs were headed toward their own breaking point, and it was coming in the form of one very unfortunate man, whose reign would become the ultimate cautionary tale of royal inbreeding. But you're not quite there yet. First, you need to see just how deep this family was willing to dig into its own ancestry to hold on to power, and what they sacrificed piece by piece, generation by generation, to stay on the throne. You walk slowly into the royal court of Spain in the late 1600s, where the atmosphere is dense with incense, candle smoke, and the quiet dread of a kingdom holding its breath. Here sits Charles II, the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, and if the Habsburg jaw had been an unsettling footnote in earlier generations, with Charles, it becomes the whole story. He's the living and barely functioning conclusion of 2 centuries of desperate inbreeding. His body is a cautionary tale carved in bone and flesh. You watch him from a respectful distance, surrounded by worried nobles and hopeful priests, and you can't help but feel the weight of inevitability pressing down like a stone ceiling. Charles was born in 1661, the only surviving son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece. So right out of the womb, Charles was carrying a genetic load most of us wouldn't wish on a cockroach. His family tree doesn't branch so much as it loops, with his father also being his great-uncle. Imagine trying to explain that at Thanksgiving. The result of this complicated lineage? Charles inherited a double dose of recessive genes, giving rise to the most extreme example of Habsburg inbreeding ever recorded. From the start, Charles was frail. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. His jaw was so massively pronounced that he couldn't chew properly and was often fed a diet of liquid foods. His tongue was unusually large, which made speaking a laborious, often embarrassing task. His immune system was a disaster. His body was painfully thin, almost skeletal in adulthood, and he had seizures, frequent infections, and bouts of violent vomiting. His court physicians reported malformed genitalia, infertility, and blood that would not congeal. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because people couldn't believe one human could suffer so many ailments without some sort of dark sorcery involved. But here's the heartbreaking twist. Despite his alarming physical and mental limitations, Charles still had to rule. You watch him seated on a golden throne slumped forward slightly, as advisors speak for him and scribes do the actual governing. Spain is falling apart, its empire crumbling, its treasury empty, but the crown is balanced, however unsteadily, on his aching skull. You wonder how often he was aware of his own limitations. Was he lucid during his reign? Did he know he was more puppet than king? Historical records suggest his mental capacity was delayed, but not completely absent. He loved theatre. He adored his second wife. He wept when he couldn't produce an heir. The portraits of Charles II are eerily honest, no flattery here. Artists couldn't airbrush the damage. His elongated jaw juts out unnaturally. His chin merges with his lower lip like 2 slabs of clay. His eyes seem vacant, a little lost, as though constantly waiting for someone to speak up and explain what's going on. The most tragic detail? Despite his suffering, Charles desperately tried to fulfill his duty. He married twice, he prayed, he sought medical cures, but the truth was baked into his DNA. He was the last flickering flame of a royal line that had burned too long on the same fuel. And here's your quirky historical side note. Charles's autopsy, performed after his death in 1700, reads like a medieval horror story. According to the doctors, his body was putrefied, full of worms, his heart the size of a peppercorn, his lungs rotten, his intestines gangrenous, and his brain full of water. Granted, autopsies back then were more poetic than precise, but the gist is clear. The poor guy's body was a genetic battlefield, and the losing side had surrendered long before the final bell rang. Now comes the scholarly debate. Was Charles II's downfall purely the result of inbreeding, or was it just one piece of a much bigger collapse? Spain was already in decline during his reign. It had overspent, overextended, and overcolonized. Some historians argue that focusing too much on Charles's health obscures the real political and economic failures of the empire. Others say the two are inseparable, that Spain's refusal to look outside the royal bloodline for new leadership was exactly what doomed it. After all, when your ruling class is genetically melting from the inside, you can't really expect efficient governance, right? You stroll now through the empty halls of Charles's palace, the once lavish rooms faded and musty. Portraits of long-dead ancestors glare down at you, each one a chapter in the story that led here. The silence is heavy. This is the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles II died without an heir, sparking a European crisis that led to the War of the Spanish Succession. His death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the final exclamation point on 2 centuries of royal self-sabotage. It's easy to make fun of Charles, the jaw, the illnesses, the parade of medical horror, but as you spend more time in his company, you begin to feel a little compassion for him. He didn't choose this, he didn't draft the marriage contracts or design the family tree. He was born into a genetic house of cards already swaying in the wind. And still he wore the crown, he endured the whispers, he outlived expectations, he tried to rule a broken empire with a broken body. As you leave his court behind, one thing becomes clear. The Habsburgs didn't just gamble with power, they gambled with nature. And nature, unlike politics, always calls its debts. Charles was the final receipt. And in the long twisted game of royal inbreeding, he was the warning no one wanted to see until it was too late. You follow the long shadow cast by Charles II into the wider corridors of European history, where the end of one royal life often signals the start of international chaos. When Charles dies in 1700, jaw clisson-menched, body broken, lineage officially extinct, Spain doesn't just lose a king, it loses stability, clarity, and any illusion that the bloodline strategy was sustainable. The throne is now empty, and every major power in Europe eyes it like a vulture circling a banquet. What follows isn't just a crisis, it's a continental scramble that explodes into one of the most devastating wars of the 18th century. Because the problem with an inbred monarchy isn't just genetic, it's geopolitical. You drift into the early 1700s as emissaries in powdered wigs and silken tights rush back and forth between capitals. Every court from Versailles to Vienna claims some right to the Spanish crown. The French Bourbons argue they have the bloodline. The Austrian Habsburgs say, well, so do we. The British and the Dutch, meanwhile, mostly want to prevent France from absorbing Spain and becoming an unstoppable super-empire. And so, over a dead king's fragile body, the War of the Spanish Succession ignites, a decade-long brawl that drags in nearly every major European power and kills over 1 million people. And it all started because one royal family couldn't stop marrying itself. You move through war rooms now. Maps are unfurled on oak tables, wax seals popping open like fireworks. At the centre of this frenzy sits the ghost of Charles II, an emperor who couldn't father a child but managed to father a war. And it's worth remembering that his fall wasn't just medical, but deeply symbolic. Spain had once been the crown jewel of Europe, a global empire flush with gold from the New World, fleets dominating the seas, colonies stretching across continents. But by the time Charles dies, the empire is bloated, brittle, and about as structurally sound as a stack of wet parchment. There were signs of decay long before Charles took the throne. Economic collapse, military overreach, a crushing reliance on silver that kept pouring in from the Americas. But even silver can't fix bad genes. And the real damage had been happening quietly in the palace nurseries, one cousin marriage at a time. By the 17th century, Spain had one of the most inbred monarchies in Europe. A 2009 genetic study calculated that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of over 25%. That's the same as if your parents were siblings. His family hadn't just tiptoed into the genetic danger zone. They'd moved in, redecorated, and thrown a coronation party. The Spanish elite knew it too. Letters from diplomats at the time speak candidly about the king's condition. The king's body, one wrote, is as fragile as his government. The court was filled with priests and doctors, not because Charles was especially religious or high maintenance, but because he was constantly on the brink of collapse. Every minor illness could be fatal. Every day without an heir, a little more doom. And yet they waited, hoping against reason that he might somehow recover or miraculously produce a son. He never did. After his death, the throne passes eventually to Philip V, a Bourbon prince and grandson of Louis XIV of France. Spain transitions from Habsburg rule to Bourbon rule, ending 2 centuries of genetic recycling. And while that sounds like a fresh start, it sparks fear across Europe. Now France and Spain are ruled by the related monarchs. Will they unite their powers? Will Louis XIV install a puppet in Madrid? The war that follows is brutal and sprawling. Cities burn, dynasties crumble, and all of it leads back to a royal bloodline that refused to open the gates to new genetic material. Here's a strange footnote. During the war, propaganda about Charles II and Habsburg inbreeding runs wild. Pamphlets circulate describing his deformities in grotesque detail, exaggerated for effect but rooted in truth. He becomes a symbol not just of decline, but of grotesque mismanagement, of unnatural governance. Political enemies use his image to condemn the entire Habsburg legacy. Look what happens, sir, they seem to say, when rulers play God with their family trees. And yet, even after this cataclysm, cousin marriage doesn't go away. Not entirely. Other dynasties keep the tradition alive, convinced they can beat the odds. The Bourbons themselves dabble in it. The French court is no stranger to cousin unions, as you'll see soon. The lesson of Charles II was loud, dramatic, and medically explicit, but it was not universally absorbed. Still, Spain's transition to Bourbon rule marks a turning point. Slowly, subtly, monarchies begin to shift their policies. Marriages start happening with a bit more biological distance. The emphasis moves from pure bloodlines to strong alliances, from uncle-niece pairings to distant cousins with less overlapping DNA. It's not the end of inbreeding, but it's the beginning of hesitation. The question now becomes, how close is too close? You exit this chapter with the image of Charles II lingering in your mind, a man whose body couldn't support the crown he was born into. His life was a monarchy in miniature, grand on the surface, crumbling underneath. And his death didn't just bring down a dynasty, it forced Europe to reckon, at least briefly, with the consequences of treating genetics like a chessboard. Of course, old habits die hard. And just across the Pyrenees, another royal family is preparing to double down on bloodline purity, convinced they'll do it better. You find yourself strolling through the sun-drenched gardens of Versailles, where everything smells faintly of roses, powdered wigs, and the inflated self-confidence of divine right. Here, under gold-plated ceilings, and within perfectly symmetrical halls, another royal family is engineering their own genetic Rubik's Cube. The Bourbons, France's most theatrical answer to royalty, have been watching their Habsburg cousins implode across the border with all the schadenfreude of an extended soap opera binge. And yet, instead of heeding the obvious red flags, they're doubling down on the exact same strategy. Marry your cousin, marry your niece. Just don't marry a nobody. That would be madness. You drift through the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, and instantly feel the difference. Where Charles II's court was heavy with decay and desperation, Versailles hums with opulence and calculated drama. There's dancing, music, gossip, layers and layers of spectacle to distract from the fact that behind closed doors, these marriages are being arranged with the subtlety of a cattle auction. Louis XIV is a master of theatre, and he understands the political necessity of keeping royal bloodlines in play. He's surrounded by daughters, nieces, and cousins, and they are chess pieces to him, moved across Europe to secure alliances and bolster France's reach. The practice of cousin marriage isn't just tolerated here, it's practically policy. Louis himself marries his double first cousin, Maria Theresa of Spain, a match that's not only expected but celebrated as a union of great Catholic powers. And sure, she brings with her the Habsburg jaw and some questionable genes, but no one's really thinking about long-term effects. It's the alliance that matters, not the haemophilia risk. You're watching history repeat itself, only this time with better fashion and tighter corsets. At court, there's a quiet understanding that keeping things in the family is a virtue. The further you reach down the social ladder, the more you risk introducing instability. Peasants with bad habits, commoners with unpredictable loyalties, or worst of all, new blood that hasn't been vetted by generations of incestuous vetting. So the Bourbon loop back on themselves. Louis XIV's brother marries their niece. His daughter marries her cousin. Children born of these unions are encouraged to continue the pattern. It's a royal relay race and everyone's passing the same chromosome baton back and forth. You might think the results would be immediate. Extra fingers, strange conditions, another Charles II waddling across the drawing room. But not quite. The Bourbons for a time seem to get away with it. Louis XIV is robust and lives into his 70s. His court is full of strong personalities and ambitious heirs. The gene pool, while shallow, hasn't yet started to show the cracks. It's more of a slow simmer than an explosion. But the warning signs are already there. You just have to look closely. Take Louis, Grand Dauphin, the Sun King's son. He marries Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, which is a slight break from cousin strategy. But then his son, Philip V, marries his double second cousin, Maria Louisa of Savoy. They're children, a tangled knot of overlapping relatives. And it's here that the mental instability starts showing up. Several descendants suffer from melancholy, erratic behaviour and mood disorders. Historians later speculate about bipolar disorder and depression, traits that quietly worm their way through Bourbon family lines, hidden under velvet coats and jewelled crowns. There's also the matter of fertility. Despite the numerous unions, child mortality remains high. Heirs are born sickly or die young. Marriages result in stillbirths or weak offspring who don't survive to adulthood. It's not dramatic enough to derail the dynasty just yet, but you can feel the tension building, like a cracked chandelier, swaying ever so slightly with each generation. Here's your weird historical fact for the night. Louis XIV's court was so obsessed with appearances that they created special padded breeches and corsets for children to force them into a specific noble posture from infancy. The goal wasn't just elegance, it was a kind of physical conformity, a visual guarantee of health and control. Meanwhile, behind those rigid clothes, some of these children were born with club feet, scoliosis, or neurological quirks that would later be dismissed as divine melancholy. And what do the scholars say? Well, some argue that the Bourbons had a better run than the Habsburgs simply because they weren't as intensely inbred. There were still cousin marriages, yes, but fewer uncle-niece pairings, fewer generational repeats. Others claim the dynasty's apparent health was just a surface illusion, and that the genetic load was slowly accumulating, masked by wealth and status. When symptoms showed up, they were brushed off as eccentricity or romanticised as noble suffering. After all, a king's sadness was never just depression, it was the burden of leadership. And a queen's infertility wasn't necessarily genetic, maybe it was just divine will, but you've seen this pattern before, you know how it ends. As the 18th century rolls on, the Bourbons' luck begins to wobble, mental illness becomes more common, infants die with alarming frequency. Later branches of the family, especially in Spain and Naples, start showing the unmistakable signs of recessive gene issues. By the time the French Revolution erupts in 1789, the monarchy is already a creaking edifice. Some blame politics, others economics. But there's no denying that after centuries of internal pairings, the once golden bloodline is now limping along on shaky DNA. You stroll now through the gardens at twilight. Versailles glows in the distance, still beautiful, still whispering of glory. But you feel the rot beneath the roses. The Bourbons may have avoided the spectacle of a Charles II, but they're far from immune. The court's obsession with blood purity created a lineage that would eventually find itself outmatched, not just politically, but biologically. The dynasty that believed in divine inheritance was, in fact, quietly inheriting failure. As you drift past mirrored halls and into the quiet wing of the palace where children once slept under silk canopies, you can almost hear the breathing of history. Shallow, uneven, and laced with denial. The Bourbons weren't yet broken, but their future was already hardwired for trouble. And the next act? Let's just say things are about to get even more tangled. You wake up to the clang of hooves on cobblestone, and the faint rustle of silk skirts brushing marble floors. The Bourbon dynasty is on the move, shuffling more cousins around like an elite matchmaking service for people who all have the same 5 ancestors. You're in the 1700s now, slipping between palaces from Paris to Naples, Madrid to Parma, and it feels less like a royal family and more like a feedback loop dressed in lace. The cousins are getting married again, surprise, and the roulette wheel of genetics is spinning faster than ever. This is the age of the Bourbon roulette, a nickname you whisper to yourself as you watch alliances form between uncles and nieces, double cousins, and the occasional second cousin just to spice things up. It's not just about France anymore. Now Bourbon blood is flooding into Spain, southern Italy and beyond, carving new lines of power through familiar DNA. You realise that Versailles wasn't the end of the story, it was the launch pad. The Bourbons are spreading like genetically compromised dandelions across the continent. Take the Spanish Bourbons, for example. When Philip V took the throne of Spain in the early 1700s, thanks in large part to Charles II's unfortunate genetic exit, he brought with him all the courtly customs and marriage strategies of his grandfather Louis XIV. That meant cousin marriage galore, his sons married into cousin houses, his grandsons married second cousins, and so on. Over time, this habit started to echo the very pattern that doomed the Habsburgs, and nobody seemed to notice, or maybe they noticed, and just quietly crossed their fingers. You stroll into a wedding banquet in Madrid where Charles IV of Spain, another Bourbon, is celebrating his union to his double first cousin, Maria Louisa of Parma. They're both direct descendants of Philip V, which means their children, well, those kids are essentially Philip V twice. Charles IV himself is physically healthy, mostly, but his descendants? They begin to show cracks. Their son Ferdinand VII marries his niece, twice, the same niece. Once she dies, he marries her younger sister. Because if the first batch of genes didn't spark an heir, you might as well double down. By this point, the Bourbon family tree starts looking less like a tree and more like a hall of mirrors. Every generation reflects the last. The same names, the same faces, and increasingly the same symptoms. The more tightly they loop their bloodlines, the more fertility problems they encounter. Children die young, pregnancies end prematurely, survivors are often sickly, emotionally unstable, or plagued by mysterious ailments. One heir faints constantly, another has unexplained rages. One is described as having fits of sadness that lingered for months. But still, the marriages continue. The roulette wheel keeps spinning. And here's the weird historical tidbit you overhear during dinner. One Spanish Bourbon prince reportedly believed he could control disease by wearing a necklace made of dried frogs. This wasn't some odd rural tradition. It was a nobleman, raised in a palace, who was taught that cousin marriage was science, but basic biology was magic. The irony practically paints itself. Meanwhile, across the border, the French Bourbons aren't doing much better. You drop in on the House of Orleans, Louis XIV's cadet line, where cousin marriages continue under the radar, dressed up as courtly tradition. You see young nobles with mild deformities hidden beneath tailored coats. You hear whispers of mental illness treated with leeches and prayer. Still, the dynasty thrives on paper. Power remains centralized. And the idea of marrying outside the family? Scandalous. But even with all this marrying and remarrying, succession is no longer smooth. Infighting becomes common. Legitimacy is questioned. And behind closed doors, the royal families begin to realize they're running out of eligible cousins. The gene pool isn't just shallow, it's evaporating. That doesn't stop them from dipping into it, though. The pressure to marry appropriately outweighs the risks. Better a deformed heir than a commoner. Here's where scholars start to diverge. Some argue that the Bourbon decline, like the Habsburgs, was as much about politics and war as it was about inbreeding. They point to revolutions, economic shifts, and the rise of Enlightenment ideals. Others say, look at the pattern, look at the diseases, the infant mortality, the neurological conditions cropping up in multiple branches of the family. It may not be as extreme as Charles II, but it's there, creeping in like mold behind expensive wallpaper. You wander through a Spanish court nursery, quiet now, and stare into cribs that once held Bourbon infants born into fragile bodies. You read letters from midwives, terrified of announcing another miscarriage. You feel the slow mounting pressure on every royal couple to produce a viable heir, and the increasingly desperate measures they'll take to do it. Herbal tonics, dangerous medicines, magical amulets, and of course another round of cousin proposals. By the late 1700s, it's clear this roulette wheel isn't rigged in their favour. Spain and France are both on the edge. Their dynasties are brittle, overextended, and poorly prepared for the revolutions barrelling toward them. When the French Revolution finally explodes, it's not just because of taxes or Enlightenment thinking. It's also because people are tired of watching a tiny, genetically looped elite hoard power and wealth while pretending it's ordained by heaven. You step back and look at the board. The Bourbon cousins are all connected, like a game of dominoes waiting to collapse. And though some survive, rebranded as constitutional monarchs in quieter modern roles, the old model is broken. The royal roulette is finally losing its glamour, and even the players are starting to notice. So the next time a crown is placed on a baby's head, the question won't be what's their title, it'll be who's their mother's cousin's brother's niece, and why does that matter? You already know the answer. It matters because too much royal roulette, too much spinning in the same shallow circle, doesn't just weaken dynasties, it erodes the very idea of royalty itself. And that idea, once divine, is now starting to wobble. You glide north now across the Channel and into the fog-draped kingdom of Great Britain, where powdered wigs are taller, emotions are quieter, and scandal hides behind the veneer of decorum. Here, the monarchy has always insisted on being different, stoic, calculated, a bit more buttoned up than their flamboyant cousins in Versailles. But if you thought they avoided the genetic pitfalls of European royalty, think again. The British royal family had its own carefully folded branches, and its own shadows lurking behind polished portraits. You step into the 18th century and find yourself in the middle of drawing rooms where blue blood still runs, just a little too familiar. You pause in the Georgian era, an age of elegant restraint and powdered reserve, and meet King George III. At first glance, he seems like a textbook monarch. Dutiful, God-fearing, a bit stiff but popular enough. He marries Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a distant cousin but not so close as to raise eyebrows. At first, they seem to escape the worst of the European cousin trap. Their marriage is happy, fertile, 15 children, which feels less like a family and more like a soccer team. But underneath this healthy facade, something begins to unravel, slowly, quietly. As you drift through Windsor Castle's corridors, whispers echo through the tapestries. Strange behaviour from the king, long conversations with empty rooms, explosive rants delivered to baffled courtiers. At first, it's dismissed as stress. Governing is hard, especially during the American Revolution, when one of the colonies throws a tea party and suddenly wants a divorce. But then the spells worsen. George III begins writing letters without stopping. His sentence is tangled and frantic. He talks until he's hoarse. He hallucinates. he loses touch with reality altogether. Now the rumours swirl, the king is mad, but what does madness mean in a royal context? Some blame it on divine punishment, others on overwork. But behind the theories lies a quieter possibility: genetic predisposition. George III is a descendant of a tightly intermarried German royal house, the House of Hanover, which had made strategic cousin marriages the norm for generations. On paper they were foreign, but in reality the same dance was happening, just with slightly different titles. When George married Charlotte, they shared more ancestors than they probably realised. A small, closed aristocratic circle, traded back and forth like a family heirloom. One theory that still divides scholars is porphyria, a rare blood disorder that can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and episodes of psychosis, symptoms eerily similar to those George displayed. Porphyria is hereditary, and it's been linked to European nobility through multiple family lines, but not everyone agrees. Some claim it was bipolar disorder, others say arsenic poisoning, or lead contamination from medicine. Modern DNA testing has been limited, and much of the evidence is circumstantial. But one thing remains disturbingly consistent. This royal lineage carried more than just tradition. It carried something dangerous. And George isn't the only one. As you leaf through the family records, you start to notice a pattern. Traces of mental instability echoing through the bloodline like a forgotten chorus. One of George's sons, Prince Ernest, has a daughter born with severe cognitive disabilities, hidden from the public. Another descendant, Princess Augusta, suffers from unexplained sadness and social withdrawal. Even Queen Victoria, a later figure we'll visit soon, had children and grandchildren who battled depression, nervous breakdowns, and emotional volatility. It's not always overt. Often it's brushed under thick Victorian rugs, but it's there. Here's a bizarre little detail for your collection. At the height of George's illness, physicians tried curing him with everything from purging and leeches to restraining him in straitjackets. One even suggested splashing him with freezing water to reset the mind. It's like someone opened a medieval medicine cabinet and just threw the whole thing at him. And the public? They were told the king was simply unwell or indisposed. No need to worry, please enjoy your scones. As the king's condition worsens, his son, also named George because apparently creativity wasn't in the gene pool either, steps in as Prince Regent. It's a polite way of saying Dad's unfit to rule, but we don't want to say it out loud. The Regency era begins, and George III lives out his final years blind, deaf, and locked away, more ghost than monarch. His legacy is a paradox, a ruler known for family values and national stability, remembered just as much for losing his grip on the throne and his mind. Historians still argue about what broke George III. Was it genetics, environmental stress, the crushing weight of empire? But the whispers of inbreeding never go away. Not in Britain, not anywhere. Because once you trace the bloodlines far enough back, they all start overlapping, tiny threads weaving the same old pattern, generation after generation. And Britain, for all its appearances, wasn't immune. The royal family may have married fewer first cousins than the Habsburgs or Bourbons, but they still believed in the sanctity of royal blood. They still selected spouses from within an exclusive circle, aristocrats, nobles, distant but still traceable relatives. The gene pool was larger than some, but not exactly Olympic-sized. As you stand beneath a portrait of George III in his red and gold regalia, you can't help but see the cracks beneath the paint. A kind, devoted man, yes. A ruler who truly believed in duty and morality, yes. But also perhaps a victim of centuries of tradition masquerading as wisdom. A king undone not just by war or rebellion, but by the slow accumulation of decisions made long before he was born. You take a deep breath. Outside the palace the fog is thick and the bells toll softly across the Thames. The madness of kings isn't just metaphorical, it's genetic, and it's not done with you yet. Because there's another monarch not far down the timeline who will pass on more than just an empire. She'll spread a secret disease through the veins of Europe, and she won't even know she's doing it. You linger for a moment at the edge of the Thames before crossing back through time, not far, just a few decades ahead, where the air is heavy with coal smoke and corseted tension. You're in Victorian England now, a time of trains, telegraphs, and empire-wide tea addiction. And at the centre of it all sits Queen Victoria herself, wrapped in black lace and widowhood, matriarch to a family that will quietly, and quite literally, bleed across Europe. What she passes down isn't just her title or her trademark scowl, it's a hidden thread woven into her descendants' blood. A single genetic twist that changes the course of royal history: hemophilia. Victoria isn't born into this curse, she brings it. Historians suspect she was a spontaneous carrier, meaning the genetic mutation responsible for hemophilia emerged in her egg cells, not from her parents. Or, more controversially, some whisper that perhaps her father wasn't her father at all. A bit of scandal often brushed under velvet rugs. Whatever the source, Victoria's X chromosome carries a secret flaw, and she has no idea. She goes on to have 9 children, several of whom inherit the faulty gene, and from there it spreads like a royal family Christmas card with a very unfortunate footnote. Hemophilia is a cruel and invisible disease. It affects the blood's ability to clot. A small cut, no big deal for most people. But for someone with hemophilia, even the tiniest bruise can turn into internal bleeding, joint pain, and, in the worst cases, death. The disease is passed down through the X chromosome, so women are usually carriers, while men are the ones most severely affected. That's the math of it. But for the royal families of Europe, it's not just biology, it's a ticking time bomb. Victoria's daughters and granddaughters marry into nearly every major royal house on the continent. Russia, Germany, Spain, sometimes for love, often for strategy. These unions bring not just political alliances, but the hemophilia gene into new courts, cloaked in lace and lace-trimmed baby blankets. Her daughter Alice carries the gene to Germany. Her daughter Beatrice brings it to Spain. And her son Leopold? He doesn't survive it. He bleeds to death from a fall at age 30. This isn't the kind of thing monarchies like to advertise, so as symptoms begin to emerge in royal children, deep bruises, swollen joints, mysterious internal bleeding, the illness is hidden from public view. Physicians are sworn to silence, letters are burned, babies are given odd nicknames, as if distancing themselves from the reality of what's happening. But behind palace walls, the anxiety grows. Every scraped knee could mean hours of agony. Every stumble could end a dynasty. One of the most famous victims is Prince Alexei, son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra of Russia, herself a granddaughter of Victoria. You'll get to know him better soon. For now, you simply peer into the Russian palace nursery and see a small, pale boy surrounded by worried adults. He's the heir to one of the most powerful empires on Earth, and yet he can barely climb stairs without risking a fatal injury. The disease clings to him like a shadow, and the desperation to cure him leads to decisions that will eventually help unravel the entire Romanov dynasty. But we'll get there. For now, let's circle back to Britain, where Queen Victoria, ever the realist, becomes increasingly aware of what she's unleashed. She doesn't call it hemophilia, of course. That terminology is still developing. But she knows, she sees it in her children, in their children, in the doctor's worried glances. Still, she never apologises. Royal marriages continue. Alliances must be made. After all, what's a little genetic roulette when the future of Europe is at stake? Here's your quirky, possibly macabre, historical fact. Queen Victoria once wrote to her daughter about their family's health woes with such cold precision that it felt more like livestock management than motherly concern. Poor Leopold's leg is worse again, she noted casually, as if she were discussing the weather or the condition of a carriage wheel. But in the same breath, she reminds her daughters to continue marrying strategically. There's always a suitable cousin or prince available. The empire needs them to produce more heirs. Functional bloodlines are optional. And here's where the scholarly tension kicks in. Some argue that the spread of haemophilia was tragic but isolated, affecting only a few unlucky branches of the tree. Others say it reveals the deeper fault lines of royal inbreeding, that even when the cousin marriages slowed, the DNA damage was already in motion. A hidden legacy passed down like antique silver, wrapped in velvet and ribbons. You drift into a late-night dinner at Balmoral Castle, where Queen Victoria sits stern and upright, her black veil casting shadows over the table. Her surviving children, some sickly, others just painfully awkward, make quiet conversation. The servants hover silently. No one mentions Leopold, no one mentions Alexei, but the air hums with the weight of unspoken knowledge. The empire may stretch across continents, but the royal bloodline now contains a silent saboteur. And this is the real twist, the one they never write into history books without a footnote. While Victoria believed she was securing peace by marrying off her children into every corner of the continent, she was also ensuring that almost every major royal house would inherit this invisible curse. Not in every child, not in every marriage, but just enough to matter, just enough to fracture thrones and fill royal cribs with worry. You leave her now, standing stiff in a portrait hall lined with faces that all share her eyes, her jaw, her quiet severity. A family dynasty, genetically stamped. She is the grandmother of Europe, yes, but also the genetic courier of a disease that would haunt her descendants for over a century. And the tragedy is, she never knew the full cost. The alliances were solid, the ceremonies were beautiful, but the blood beneath the crown was starting to slip. You step quietly into a Russian winter, the snow crunching softly beneath your boots, as if the land itself is trying not to wake the boy sleeping upstairs. You're in the grand palace of the Romanovs now, where chandeliers sparkle like icicles and the weight of empire sits heavily on every gilded frame and silk-upholstered chair. It's 1904, and Empress Alexandra, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, has just given birth to a long-awaited son. The imperial family is ecstatic. Russia finally has a male heir, a future Tsar. They name him Alexei, and for a fleeting moment, the halls of the Winter Palace echo with laughter and hope. But that hope won't last. Just weeks after his birth, Alexei begins to show signs that something is very wrong. A small bruise on his thigh turns into an alarming swelling. His cries grow sharper, more panicked. A minor bump leads to days of agony. The doctors are baffled at first, careful not to alarm the Empress, but Alexandra isn't stupid. She knows what this is. She saw it in her own family. She knows the curse running quietly through Victoria's descendants. And now it's claimed her son. Hemophilia has entered the Romanov dynasty. From that moment on, Alexei's life becomes a carefully choreographed routine of protection. His steps are watched. His toys are padded. His playmates are few. You can almost see the dread thick in the air around him, as if every corridor he walks is lined not just with guards, but with prayers. And while Nicholas II, the Tsar, tries to put on a brave face, Alexandra collapses into anxiety. She becomes obsessed with her son's condition, terrified that a single fall could end not just his life, but the entire future of the monarchy. And that fear becomes a vacuum, a desperation that draws in something far darker than illness. Enter Rasputin. The so-called mad monk arrives at court in 1905, a mystic from Siberia with wild eyes, oily hair, and a presence that feels like a fever dream. He claims he can help Alexei, not with medicine but with prayer, with healing touch, with divine intervention. And when Alexei's symptoms briefly subside under Rasputin's care, Alexandra becomes convinced. This strange man isn't just a healer, he's sent by God. Soon Rasputin becomes her most trusted confidant, allowed into inner chambers, his influence stretching all the way into state affairs. You watch from the corner of a dimly lit drawing room as nobles begin to whisper. Rasputin is coarse, erratic, reeking of drink and contradiction. He speaks in riddles, demands loyalty, and yet, somehow, Alexei improves when he's near. Doctors are furious. Ministers are horrified. But Alexandra clings to him, because Rasputin promises what no one else can, her son's survival, her dynasty's salvation. And in doing so, he seals their fate. Because the Russian people aren't blind. They see Rasputin's rise. They see the Empress retreating behind closed doors, speaking to a man with no title and too many secrets. They see the cracks in the Romanov facade, and hemophilia, though still hidden from the public, becomes part of the rot behind the curtain. The royal family starts to look weak, cursed, tainted by mysticism and incompetence. And all of it stems from a boy too fragile to play with his cousins. Here's your quirky, haunting fact. Rasputin once predicted that if he were killed by the members of the royal family, the entire Romanov line would fall within 2 years. Spoiler, they were, and it did. The tragedy of Alexei isn't just his illness, it's what it triggers. His condition is the match that lights the fuse of desperation in his mother, which brings Rasputin to power, which undermines the legitimacy of the monarchy, which accelerates the revolution that's already brewing. Russian soldiers are dying in World War I. Bread lines stretch for miles, and meanwhile, behind palace gates, the Tsar is listening to a peasant mystic while his son bleeds in silence. Some scholars still debate whether Rasputin actually had any healing power. Perhaps his calming presence reduced Alexandra's anxiety, which in turn calmed Alexei. Maybe he suggested stopping certain harmful treatments, like aspirin, which thins the blood. Or maybe it was coincidence. Hemophilia often comes in episodes. and periods of relief can appear miraculous. We don't really know. What we do know is that his influence became politically toxic, and Alexei's illness, though secret, was the reason Rasputin had any power at all. You watch Alexei in quieter moments, bundled in layers, face pale, eyes sharp. He's not oblivious. He knows he's different. He sees the worry in his mother's eyes, the way the servants hover, the tears she wipes when she thinks no one's looking. He tries to be brave. He reads. He laughs when he can. But his world is small, narrowed by fear, padded and quieted by a family that can't bear to lose him, and a world that eventually will. By the time the Russian Revolution begins to rage in Touch 17, the Romanovs are already ghosts in their own palace. The haemophilia, though hidden from the people, has done its damage. It made the monarchy retreat. It broke the Empress's judgment. It gave Rasputin a throne of his own, and it turned the last Tsar into a man who no longer knew how to rule. Eventually, Alexei will be taken with the rest of his family to a house in Yekaterinburg. He'll be promised safety. He'll sleep under guard. And one night he'll be woken by men with rifles and bayonets. The disease that made him fragile couldn't protect him in the end. The blood that wouldn't clot couldn't stop the execution. And the gene that started in a British palace will end here, in a dark Russian basement. You step away from the snow, back into the long corridor of history, and realise just how far-reaching a single mutation can be. Victoria never knew, Alexandra could never have imagined, but a fragile boy born into gold carried with him the unravelling of an empire. And he's not the only one. The snow hasn't even settled on the Romanov tragedy before you're pulled westward again, back into drawing rooms draped in lace and framed portraits of men in sashes and women in pearl-studded tiaras. You're tracing the fault lines of a hidden illness, not just in Russia but across an entire continent. Queen Victoria's haemophilia gene didn't stop with Alexei. It kept travelling, quietly hitching rides in the bloodstream of royal children tucked inside dowries and woven into baby blankets. You're walking now through palaces in Germany and Spain, flipping open family albums where more than one royal heir was handed a crown and a bleeding disorder. Victoria's daughters had been highly sought after, not for their charm, though they had it in polite Victorian doses, but for their political value. Marrying a daughter of the Queen of England meant strengthening ties to the world's largest empire, and so her children were spread like chess pieces across Europe. But what none of their husbands knew, what even Victoria herself hadn't fully understood, was that several of her daughters were carrying a ticking genetic time bomb. Haemophilia was never written into marriage contracts. It didn't show up in portraits, but it made itself known generation after generation in the quiet tragedies behind royal nursery doors. You start in Germany, where Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter, married Louis IV, 4th Grand Duke of Hesse. Their union produced 7 children, including little Friedrich, nicknamed Fritti. He was beautiful, fair-haired, adored, but he had haemophilia. When he was just 2.5, he fell from a window. It was a short fall, survivable for most children, but Fritti began to hemorrhage internally. Nothing the doctors did could stop the bleeding. He died slowly in agony, as Alice held him and wept. It shattered her. She wrote that her heart felt broken in two, and her letters took on a new gravity after that. She understood now what she had passed on. Then there's Beatrice, Victoria's youngest, who married Prince Henry of Battenberg. She too was a carrier, and her son Leopold inherited the disease. He survived into adulthood, but lived cautiously, knowing even the slightest injury could be fatal. He died from a hip injury after a minor fall, while serving in the British Army in Africa. One small fracture, one wrong movement, one unclosable wound. His death was swept aside in official narratives, overshadowed by colonial campaigns and royal marriages, but behind the scenes the family knew. The pattern was no longer avoidable. It had taken root. You're now in Spain and the atmosphere grows tense. Victoria Eugenie, another granddaughter of the Queen, marries King Alfonso III of Spain. Her bloodline brings English prestige to the Spanish court. The wedding is grand, the papers call her beautiful, and the Spanish people, somewhat reluctantly, accept a foreign queen. But within a few years, 2 of her sons are diagnosed with haemophilia. It's a political and personal disaster. Alfonso reportedly flies into rage when he learns the truth. He blames her. "You have ruined my life," tells her, coldly, as though she had chosen to poison the bloodline herself. Their marriage, already strained by cultural differences and Alfonso's string of affairs, deteriorates completely. Victoria Eugenie becomes a ghost queen, tolerated but never loved, confined to ceremonial appearances while privately tending to her sons. One of them, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, renounces his rights to the throne to marry a commoner, one small rebellion in a lifetime defined by constraint. Another, Jaime, suffers from hemophilia and is also rendered nearly deaf by a childhood surgery gone wrong. Between them, the future of the Spanish monarchy grows fragile and uncertain, all because of an invisible twist in a single gene. You're beginning to see the pattern too clearly now. Royal weddings full of pomp and glory followed by quiet horror in the nurseries. Mothers pacing nervously as doctors whisper behind doors. Tiny coffins carried out the back of palaces. And through it all, the family trees keep branching out, only to fold back in again. Cousins marrying cousins. Carriers marrying into new bloodlines that aren't as new as they appear. The haemophilia gene spreads silently through elegant dining rooms, tucked into the curls of little princes, waiting. And here's the odd historical footnote. Victoria Eugenie knew about the haemophilia risk before her wedding. The British royal family tried to keep it hushed, but rumours had started to leak. Still, the political alliance was too tempting. The marriage went forward anyway, and that decision, rooted in diplomacy over biology, introduced the gene to yet another royal house. It's almost poetic in its cruelty. The pursuit of stability ensured the very fragility they were trying to avoid. By the early 20th century, the curse of haemophilia is well known among European monarchs, even if it's never acknowledged publicly, is the great unspeakable. And unlike other traits, like the Habsburg jaw or delicate constitutions, this one can't be concealed with fashion or public pageantry. It kills, and it does so quietly, often off-stage, away from cameras and crowds. A scraped knee at the wrong time, a bruise that won't fade, a boy who should have ruled but instead is buried with medals he never earned. There's still scholarly debate today about how widespread the disease actually was. Some historians argue it was confined to a few lines and didn't have the dynastic impact we now assign it. Others believe it altered the fate of Europe, softening monarchies, disrupting succession plans, weakening already brittle empires. What's certain is that the idea of blue blood takes on a cruel irony when the blood itself is the problem. You leave these palaces behind, their faded portraits and blood-stained birthrights, and begin to realise something chilling. The haemophilia wasn't just a genetic fluke, it was a metaphor made literal. A dynasty so obsessed with purity had accidentally built its own undoing into the very thing it treasured most, its blood. You return to the cold silence of the Winter Palace, where marble columns stand like frozen sentinels, and the grandeur feels eerily disconnected from the lives that once played out behind these walls. You're here for the boy again, Alexei, the last Tsarevich of Russia. But this time you're not just watching the slow unravelling of his body, you're watching the way his illness reshaped the very axis of Russian politics, how a single bleeding child became the linchpin in a royal family's collapse, and how one desperate mother let a mystic into her heart, her bedroom, and her government. Rasputin is back, and the stakes are higher than ever. By now, Alexei is older, 6, 7, 8, just old enough to understand that he's not like other children. You see it in the way he carries himself, careful with every step. He's playful, intelligent, even mischievous when his health allows, but he's never carefree, and neither is his mother. Alexandra, Empress of Russia, floats through the halls like a woman underwater. Her letters are heavy with fear, her days consumed by prayer. She's lost all trust in her doctors. They can't help him, only one man can, and that man is a holy peasant with wild eyes and the social graces of a bar brawler. You hear his name before you see him. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. They call him a starets, a wanderer, a healer, a prophet, a madman. He's all of these and none. What he truly is, to Alexandra, is hope. And hope, when it's all you have left, can make you invite very strange people into very sacred spaces. Rasputin enters the imperial circle not as an equal, but as a necessity. Every time Alexei starts bleeding and won't stop, it's Rasputin who calms Alexandra, who prays beside her, who whispers that the boy will survive, and, most maddeningly, sometimes he does. You watch, sceptical, as Rasputin touches the boy's forehead, speaks in hushed tones, and then retreats to the shadows. The bleeding slows, the boy rests. Was it hypnosis? A placebo effect, the absence of medicine instead of its presence? Some historians later point out that Rasputin often advised against the use of aspirin, a known blood thinner, though the imperial doctors didn't realise that yet. Others say he had a calming effect on the boy, reducing his stress, which in turn eased the symptoms. Still others suggest it was just coincidence. Haemophilia flares up, then calms down, often with no warning. Whatever the case, Rasputin becomes, to Alexandra, a miracle worker. But to everyone else, he's a political grenade. Rasputin's growing influence becomes the scandal of St. Petersburg. Nobles whisper in salons, ministers send frantic letters, the church is appalled. Even Nicholas II, the Tsar himself, seems unsure of how to handle the situation. On one hand, he loves his wife and wants to protect his son. On the other, he sees Rasputin's presence eroding trust in the monarchy. When Rasputin's private habits become public, his drinking, his womanizing, his eerie hold over Alexandra, the public begins to view the entire Romanov family as corrupted, even perverse. The whispers grow teeth. You drift into a late-night session of the Duma, Russia's legislative body, where politicians openly demand Rasputin be expelled from court. They blame him for bad appointments, failing military leadership and general chaos. The empire is already stumbling under the weight of World War I. The Russian army is undersupplied and unprepared. The people are starving. And back in the palace, Rasputin is helping pick cabinet ministers. It's like treating an open wound with incense and conspiracy. The hatred grows, but Rasputin doesn't flinch. If anything, he revels in it. He believes he is protected by God, by Alexandra, by fate, and for a while it seems he is. Attempts to discredit him fail. Accusations bounce off like rain, but you can feel the pressure building, and eventually it snaps. In 916, a group of aristocrats lures Rasputin to a palace under the guise of a party. They feed him poisoned cakes and wine, enough cyanide to kill a horse, but he doesn't die, so they shoot him in the chest. He falls, then stands back up. They shoot him again, still not dead. Finally, they beat him, tie him up, and throw him into the icy Neva River. When his body is recovered, his lungs are filled with water. That means he didn't die from the poison, or the bullets, or the beating. He drowned. Somehow, Rasputin's final act is to confirm his own legend. Even in death, he refuses to go quietly. And yet the damage is already done. Killing Rasputin doesn't save the monarchy. It's too late. The people no longer trust the royal family. Alexandra is still seen as weak, foreign, hysterical. Nicholas is viewed as disconnected, indecisive, increasingly irrelevant. And the boy, the bleeding frail heir, is no longer seen as a symbol of hope. He's a symbol of fragility, of destiny crumbling under the weight of tradition and denial. Here's your strange detail. Rasputin's personal letters included warnings to Nicholas. "If I die," he wrote, "you will lose your son and your throne within months." Was it prophecy, paranoia? Or did he simply know that his absence would expose the family's secrets for what they were? Desperate, decaying and doomed. The revolution comes quickly after. In 1917, the Romanovs are arrested. Nicholas abdicates. The family is exiled. The empire, once the largest in the world, collapses like a stage set after the final scene. And at the heart of it all, whether whispered or shouted, lies one quiet, devastating truth. The heir could not bleed. The dynasty could not survive. You leave that chapter shaken, not just by the madness of Rasputin or the fall of a monarchy, but by the reminder that sometimes history doesn't turn on battles or treaties, but on bodies, on blood, on the desperate, impossible desire to protect a child born with a secret that no amount of gold could cover. And yet, you know this wasn't the last time a dynasty risked everything to keep power in the family. The snow over Russia melts into rain as you drift toward the next moment, the final chapter of the Romanov story. It's July 1918, and the world is mid-collapse. Empires are crumbling like pastry one after another, and the former Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, is no longer a ruler but a prisoner. You walk beside the imperial family now, but the corridors are bare. No more ballrooms, no court musicians, just creaking floorboards, damp air, and the fading illusion of ceremony. They are in Yekaterinburg, housed in the Ipatiev House, which the Bolsheviks euphemistically call the House of Special Purpose. That alone should tell you everything you need to know. It's been months since their arrest. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the haemophiliac heir, Alexei, are confined here under watch. At first, the treatment is somewhat restrained. They're allowed their possessions, meals are provided, a few servants remain. But the walls tighten with each passing week. Food becomes scarce, guards grow colder, windows are boarded. Outside, the Russian Civil War is raging, and the Bolsheviks are on edge. If the Romanovs are rescued, even symbolically, the White Army loyalist forces might rally behind them. The family's presence is no longer a legal issue, it's a military threat. Inside, Alexei is declining. He's had another episode, an internal hemorrhage in his thigh that leaves him unable to walk. He spends most days in bed, reading or listening to his sisters sing quietly. You imagine what that must have felt like, the imperial eagle reduced to whispered lullabies and the sharp scent of iodine. The boy once destined to rule a vast empire can't even climb stairs. He's wrapped in pillows, his joints swollen, his body betraying him in the same quiet, cruel ways it always has. His illness, which once brought him Rasputin, now brings only silence. The guards begin to mock the family, stealing their food, tampering with their belongings. But the Romanovs remain eerily calm. Alexandra writes in her diary every day. The girls sew, pray and keep up appearances. It's hard to tell whether it's strength or delusion, maybe both. They still dress for dinner, they still braid their hair. But they know, Alexandra especially. She's read the air before, back when Alexei first started bleeding. She knows what's coming, and then it does. In the early hours of July 17th, 1918, the family is awakened and told to dress. They are being moved, they're told, for their safety. Nicholas, ever the obedient figurehead, believes them. Alexandra suspects otherwise. Alexei is carried down by a servant. He's too weak to walk. The family is led to a basement room, small, empty, the walls freshly whitewashed. The guards file in after them, not speaking. Then a command is read aloud, a death sentence. The first bullets hit Nicholas. He falls quickly. Alexandra is next, but then the chaos begins. The bullets bounce off the daughters' corsets, because unknown to the guards, the girls had sewn diamonds and jewellery into the lining of their clothes, thinking they'd need to hide their wealth. The gems acted like armour. The executioners panic. The room fills with screams. Bayonets are used. It is brutal, disorganised, and takes far too long. Alexei, weakened by disease, doesn't die immediately. He lies bleeding on the floor, wounded but alive. Finally, a guard shoots him in the head. The boy who had consumed the hopes of a monarchy, who had brought mystics into palaces and tipped the scales of revolution, dies in silence. There is no fanfare, no mourning choir, just a basement filled with gunpowder smoke and the last echoes of a fallen empire. The bodies are stripped, mutilated, burned, buried in secret. The executioners lie. For years, no one knows for sure if the family is dead. Rumours swirl that Anastasia escaped, that Alexei was smuggled out, that somewhere the Romanovs are alive, waiting. But those stories, romantic, tragic, half-true, only distract from what really happened. A royal family, already destroyed from the inside by genetic fragility and political blindness, was finally crushed from the outside by revolution. Here's the unsettling fringe detail. When forensic scientists exhumed the bodies decades later, they found the telltale signs of haemophilia in Alexei's remains. Bone damage, swelling, a fracture that hadn't healed. Modern DNA confirmed what had long been whispered. The Tsarevich carried the disease, and his mother was the carrier. The genetics jury Queen Victoria had unknowingly set in motion had ended here, in a Siberian pit. Scholars still argue about how much haemophilia really mattered in the Romanovs' fall. Was it the decisive factor, or just a tragic footnote? Some say the revolution would have happened anyway, that the empire was too bloated, too cruel, too resistant to change. But others see it differently. They see Alexei's illness as the destabilizing force that allowed Rasputin to rise, that weakened Alexandra's credibility, that isolated the family from their advisors. Without haemophilia, there might not have been Rasputin. Without Rasputin, there might have been no revolution, at least not like this. You stand now in the quiet woods outside Yekaterinburg, where wild flowers grow over unmarked graves and the sun trees whisper more kindly than the court ever did. And you think about how empires fall, not always with war or invasion, but sometimes with a cut that won't stop bleeding, a bruise that never fades, a mother's desperate prayer, a child who can't walk down the stairs. This is what inbreeding leaves behind, not just a broken gene, but but a trail of decisions warped by fear and tradition. The Romanovs didn't just fail politically, they failed biologically. And in the end, the blood that made them royal is the same blood that marked them for death. Blue, red, divine, cursed. It didn't matter. The revolution didn't care, it had its own blood to spill. The road winds back to Austria now, where the Habsburgs, yes, those same Habsburgs are still hanging on. It's the early 20th century, and despite everything, the dynasty is still technically alive, albeit gasping for breath. You walk through the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, past relics of an empire stretched far too thin, and you wonder, how are they still here? After the jaws, the infertility, the neurological spirals, the cousin-swapping ceremonies, how did this family survive another century? The answer lies partly in denial and partly in inertia. Sometimes it takes more than just bad genes to bring an empire down, but make no mistake, those genes were still doing their quiet work. By this point, the inbreeding is more discreet than it was during the heyday of Charles II, but it's still present. The Habsburgs didn't suddenly open up the gene pool and start courting bakers' daughters. They just got marginally better at selecting spouses from the slightly less related branches of nobility, and even then, it's more of a half-hearted sidestep than a clean break. The preference for marrying within the same elite families, the same old cousins with slightly different last names, remained. You stand at a wedding in the late 1800s where the guests raise crystal glasses to toast a union between two people who can both trace their ancestry back to the same great-grandmother. Again, one of the more peculiar symptoms still on full display is the infamous Habsburg jaw. It hasn't gone anywhere. Medical studies conducted decades later confirm that mandibular prognathism and other maxillofacial anomalies remain statistically more common among Habsburg descendants than in the general population. It's practically their brand at this point, and the portraits don't lie. From Emperor Franz Joseph to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the chin is still doing a lot of work, less cartoonishly prominent than in Charles II's day, but still a visible echo of centuries of incestuous matchmaking. And yes, that Franz Ferdinand, the one whose assassination in Sarajevo will spark World War I, he's a Habsburg too, born into the imperial house at a time when their grip on power is more ceremonial than absolute. His own marriage to Sophie Chotek, a woman of lower nobility, was seen as scandalous, not because she was a peasant, she wasn't, but because she wasn't from a reigning royal house. The marriage was deemed morganatic, meaning their children wouldn't inherit France's titles or dynastic rights, which, if we're being honest, was probably the healthiest thing that ever happened to the bloodline. But the fallout from that decision? Predictably dramatic. France's uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, is furious. The court looks down on Sophie, and Franz himself becomes increasingly isolated from his own family. In a poetic twist, his assassination in 1914 by a Serbian nationalist isn't just a political disaster. It's a family tragedy with empire-sized consequences. One bullet, one dying archduke, and suddenly the whole fragile scaffolding of old world Europe begins to crumble. The dominoes fall fast and the Habsburgs are smack in the middle of it. You might think finally this would be the end, that the war, the political upheaval, the humiliating treaties would finally crush the dynasty for good. But no, like a stubborn relic, the Habsburg name lingers. After the empire is dissolved in 1918, Charles I, Franz Ferdinand's nephew, tries to hold things together. He's crowned Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary during the final moments of imperial relevance. But his reign is short and pitiful. He's exiled by 1921, the monarchy is abolished, and yet Charles doesn't give up. He makes 2 attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne. Both fail. He dies at age 34 from pneumonia, leaving behind a wife and 8 children. His wife, by the way, Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Yes, Bourbon, as in the same dynasty that gave us the overbred kings of France and Spain. So not exactly a fresh start for the gene pool. The children of Charles and Zita continue the pattern, marrying into the usual suspects. More royals, more distant cousins, and just enough variation to avoid immediate disaster. But the echoes of old decisions are still present. Medical issues persist in quiet corners. Fertility troubles, autoimmune disorders, developmental delays whispered about but rarely confirmed. It's all carefully hidden behind charity work and ceremonial functions, but you can see the strain. Here's the quirky bit. After being deposed, Charles V was beatified by the Catholic Church. He's on track for sainthood, pending a second confirmed miracle. So yes, the last emperor of Austria, whose bloodline helped define the limits of royal inbreeding, is now considered a potential saint. Because history isn't just ironic, it's borderline theatrical. And here's where scholars get a little tangled. Some argue that by the 20th century, the worst of the inbreeding had tapered off, and that the real downfall of the Habsburgs was political, not biological. Others insist that the damage was already too deep, that centuries of marrying within an elite handful of families left them intellectually and physically vulnerable in subtle but critical ways. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. The dynasty didn't fall solely because of bad genes, but it didn't survive them either. You walk now through the ruins of Schönbrunn Palace, once the jewel of the empire, now a museum where tourists pose in front of marble fountains. The chandeliers still sparkle, the gardens are trimmed, but the royal apartments are silent. You can almost hear the fading echoes of carefully planned weddings, of whispered courtships, of 1,000 cousin matches orchestrated to preserve an empire. And none of it mattered in the end. The empire is gone, the titles are honorary, and the bloodline, though still technically alive in a few scattered nobles, is diluted, tired, ceremonial at best. This is the aftermath of royal inbreeding, not with a bang, but with a soft fade. The Habsburgs didn't collapse in a single tragic moment. They wore themselves out. One cousin marriage at a time, one failing heir, one crushed alliance, until all that remained was the jaw, the name, and a very well-curated collection of furniture. The nursery is quiet now. You walk slowly through a room that once held cribs carved with royal crests, walls decorated with silk wallpaper, and toy chests filled with handmade figurines. This is where the royal story often took its darkest, most concealed turns. Not on battlefields or at coronations, but in the pale glow of candlelight, in whispers between midwives and chambermaids. You're in the forgotten spaces of royal palaces now, the back wings, the silent wings, where malformed infants were hidden away, where bloodlines faltered behind curtains, and where the legacy of inbreeding made itself known before it could even speak. There's an old phrase whispered in royal households: the child did not thrive. It's a polite, antiquated way of saying something went very wrong. Sometimes it meant the baby was born too early and didn't survive. Sometimes it meant the child was deformed, ill, or mentally impaired and quietly removed from public view. In the age before genetics could be understood, all of it was blamed on the mother, or sin, or fate. Rarely did anyone look at the family tree and notice the loops. Even more rarely did they speak of it aloud. You hover near a 19th century birthing room in Vienna where a baby is born blue and limp. He lives only a few hours. The priest arrives first, then the physician, then the silence. No official announcement is made. The child's name is never entered into the ledger of heirs. The mother is told it was God's will, but the truth is written in her eyes, and in the eyes of the nurse who had helped deliver 4 of her cousin's babies, all of them marked by the same pattern. Elongated skulls, underdeveloped limbs, eyes that never opened. This isn't unique to the Habsburgs. You see it again in the Bourbons, in the Saxe-Coburg and Goethas, in the Braganzas of Portugal, the Romanovs, royal families across Europe dealing with fragile pregnancies and ghost children. The records are sparse, intentionally so. What survives are fragments, court letters mentioning a loss, hastily drawn of family trees with gaps, rumours in the press about children who were taken to the countryside for their health and never seen again. And every time you think you've found an answer, you hit another wall of royal discretion. Some children were born with visible deformities, club feet, cleft palates, twisted limbs. Others suffered from conditions that would now be labelled as genetic syndromes: microcephaly, hydrocephalus, disorders of sexual development. Back then, they were simply called monstrous births. The term itself chills you. In those days, even minor abnormalities could damn a child to exile or a lifetime of secrecy. If a prince couldn't walk, he couldn't rule. If a princess couldn't speak clearly, she couldn't be married off. In a world where marriage meant treaty and heirs meant survival, biology was everything and mercy rarely. You peer into a faded letter written by Queen Maria Boieiras of Portugal, whose reign was clouded by grief and mental instability. She lost multiple children in infancy, some of them never named publicly. One was rumoured to be born with severe hydrocephalus. Another had fused limbs. In the same dynasty, intermarriage between cousins had become tradition. By the time Maria married her uncle, yes, her uncle, the pool was already shallow. The results spoke for themselves, though no one wanted to listen. And then there are the ones who lived. The defective heirs, royals who were allowed to survive but whose lives were shrouded in privacy and often pity. You picture Prince John, the youngest son of George V and Queen Mary of Britain. He had epilepsy and learning disabilities. He was rarely seen in public, and by the time he reached adolescence, he was sent to live in a separate house on the royal estate with a nurse. His death at age 13 was officially mourned, but quietly. A footnote. Some historians now argue that he was loved, protected, and given a peaceful life. Others see his story as one of isolation, a symbol of a dynasty that couldn't cope with imperfection. Even now, the royal archives hold secrets. Some files are sealed. Others were destroyed long ago, perhaps by queens who could no longer carry the shame, or by courtiers eager to protect a narrative of divine blood, flawless and unbroken. Scholars have tried to piece together the missing stories, to trace sudden disappearances in court records, or identify unnamed children buried in royal crypts. But for every confirmed account, there are 10 that dissolve into rumour. And here's your eerie fact. Some royal families went so far as to create elaborate backstories for their missing children. One Spanish infant born in the early 1800s was declared dead at birth, only for evidence to later suggest he had lived into childhood at a private villa under a different name. In France, during the time of Louis XV, there are whispers of an invisible daughter. A princess born with such severe deformities she was never seen by the public, her existence known only to her immediate family and a handful of servants. Whether she was hidden, institutionalized, or quietly disposed of, no one knows for sure, and the scholarly debate, it centers on how much of this was truly caused by inbreeding and how much was simply the result of poor medicine, high infant mortality rates, or bad luck. Some argue that we've retroactively assigned too much blame to genetics, that in the context of the time, infant death was tragically common at every level of society. But then again, the pattern is too consistent to ignore. When the same conditions appear generation after generation, within families that refuse to marry beyond their inner circle, the correlation starts to feel less like coincidence and more like inevitability. You return once more to the quiet nursery. The toys are untouched. The cradle is still. The walls are lined with portraits of other children, those who lived, who wore crowns, who smiled in formal portraits, the ones who thrived. And yet, somewhere in the fabric of these tapestries, in the gaps between names and titles, you sense the presence of all those who didn't. Their stories weren't recorded, but their existence, brief, hidden, painful, was part of the cost of royalty. Inbreeding didn't just reshape jaws or pass on blood disorders. It left a trail of tiny lives that never became legacies. The air in the palace feels different now, lighter somehow, as if someone's cracked a window and let the centuries of incense and obligation drift out into the breeze. You're stepping into a different kind of royal story tonight, one with fewer rules, fewer loops in the family tree, and just a hint of rebellion in the air. This is the story of the outliers, the scandalous exceptions, the royal black sheep who, for one reason or another, refused to follow the cousin marriage playbook. And what happened when they dared to fall in love with someone who wasn't their own DNA, dressed in a crown? You meet them slowly, one at a time, and they're often younger sons, distant daughters, people with less to lose and more room to breathe. But not always. Sometimes it's the heir themselves who says, "No, I'd rather marry for affection," or at least someone with an entirely different set of grandparents. These choices weren't always romantic rebellions. Sometimes they were calculated breaks, and sometimes, yes, they were just a breathless plunge into scandal. Take Princess Louise, daughter of Queen Victoria. The woman could have married any number of eligible German princes, continuing the family tradition of trading bloodlines like fine china. But she didn't. She married John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, a commoner by royal standards, albeit a nobleman, a Brit and non-prince. The match caused an uproar in royal circles, and Victoria herself was initially horrified, but Louise held firm, and for a moment the walls around royal marriage cracked just enough for someone new to walk in. The marriage wasn't a fairy tale, to be honest. John Campbell was complicated. There are whispers that he may have preferred male companionship, and Louise herself was fiercely independent. Still, they stayed married, mostly amicably, and never had children. But the point wasn't the outcome, it was the act. For the first time in generations, someone inside the House of Windsor stepped outside the royal echo chamber to choose a spouse for something other than bloodline symmetry. And once one person does it, others begin to imagine doing it too. You drift through the palaces of Scandinavia, where kings and queens have long been a little more relaxed about the whole inbreeding tradition. These monarchies were smaller, less obsessed with divine blood, and far more willing to marry nobles or even wealthy commoners. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, these countries began experimenting with modern marriages earlier than the rest of Europe. Marriages based on political compatibility, personal connection, and yes, even love. And the result? Fewer hemophiliacs, fewer cousins at the altar, and a little more room in the royal gene pool to breathe. Then there's Edward VIII, who blew the doors off the entire system. You remember him. He's the one who abdicated the British throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. No cousin, no crown, just drama. Say what you will about Edward, and there's plenty to say, but he snapped a thread that had bound the monarchy for centuries. By choosing a partner based on personal desire rather than dynastic strategy, he forced the institution to reckon with itself in a way it hadn't since the days of Henry VIII, who, let's be honest, had a very different approach to problematic marriages. And here's your delightful fringe fact. Edward and Wallis once threw a dinner party with a guest list composed almost entirely of exiled royals and disinherited aristocrats. It was essentially a mixer for people who'd given up thrones, been cut out of inheritances, or just married the wrong kind of person. They called it the abdication ball, and the jokes probably wrote themselves. But not all these rule-breaking marriages ended in exile or scandal. Some, shockingly, went well. Queen Margrethe II of Denmark married Henri de la Borde de Montpezat, a French diplomat, not a royal, not even close. They were married for over 50 years. Queen Letizia of Spain, a former journalist. Crown Princess Mary of Denmark, an Australian commoner. All these unions would have been unthinkable a century ago, and yet here they are, functional, modern, and scandal-free, and no shared great-grandparents. What these stories show you is that breaking tradition doesn't always mean breaking the institution. In fact, it may have saved it. As the 20th century steamrolled through Europe, most monarchies fell. But the ones that remained, the constitutional monarchies, began to loosen the bloodline grip. They started marrying people with full genetic distance, people who'd been to public school, people who'd never worn a tiara unless it was part of a costume party. And the sky didn't fall, the children were healthy, the public approved, the monarchies adapted, however grudgingly, to a world that didn't worship royal blood in quite the same way. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Traditionalists still sniffed at these morganatic unions, where the spouse wasn't royal and the children might not inherit certain titles. Some countries had laws forbidding such marriages outright. In Luxembourg, for instance, royal family members once had to ask parliamentary permission to marry non-nobles. But gradually even these restrictions faded. The world was changing, and royal families, if they wanted to survive, had to keep up or get out. Scholars look back at these exception marriages with interest. Some view them as anomalies, barely affecting the broader pattern. Others see them as crucial pivot points. If every royal had continued marrying their cousin, the modern European monarchies might have vanished entirely, not just politically, but biologically. In a way, marrying outside the family wasn't just rebellion, it was survival. You take one last look at a dusty portrait gallery and realise how few of the people pictured there ever had a real choice. Their lives were shaped by obligation, by treaties disguised as love, by the delusion that keeping it in the family was always safer, cleaner, divine. But the rare few who stepped outside that loop, they didn't just change their bloodlines, they changed history's trajectory. And now, finally, the gene pool is starting to look like a pool again, not a puddle. The palaces are still standing, but their walls are thinner. The blood is still royal, but no longer strangled by its own purity. And somewhere a baby is born to a queen and a man who once worked in marketing or the navy or television, and no one checks the family tree. They just count the fingers, kiss the cheeks, and let the child sleep. The palaces are quieter now, the drama dimmed, but the damage remains, layered into royal myths, like soot on a marble bust. You step into the present day, not with the aim of judgment, but with a magnifying glass. You're here to peer beneath the carefully polished narrative, to untangle what was rumour, what was science, and what was flat out misdiagnosed. Because even now, scholars and physicians are still sorting through the archives trying to separate actual genetic disorders from centuries of superstition, politics, and wildly overblown gossip. Welcome to the foggy borderland between myth and medicine. Back in the day, if a royal slurred his speech or limped down the palace steps, you didn't get a diagnosis. You got a scandal. A queen who suffered from melancholia was branded hysterical. A prince who didn't speak clearly must have been cursed or secretly simple or dangerously unfit. The language was often poetic, cruel, or evasive. Terms like nervous disposition, divine affliction, or spiritual malaise masked what were, in all likelihood, actual neurological or genetic conditions. Take poor King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He's remembered now as the Mad King, a dreamy romantic who built extravagant castles, commissioned operas, and allegedly spoke to swans. But dig deeper, and you find that his so-called madness was as much political smear as it was genuine mental illness. Some historians believe he may have suffered from schizotypal personality disorder, or even autism spectrum traits, things we have words for now, but didn't then. At the time, his eccentric behaviour was enough for him to be declared insane and deposed. Was he truly unstable, or just inconvenient? Then there's the string of so-called mad queens who litter European history books like tragic footnotes. Juana of Castile, dubbed Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, was locked away in a convent for decades, allegedly due to her erratic behaviour. But modern scholars suspect postpartum depression, grief, or maybe bipolar disorder, not madness. She lost her husband young, was deeply isolated, and had every reason to unravel. And yet instead of support, she got exile. You can't help but notice how often madness was code for in the way. Even physical conditions were often misunderstood or exaggerated. A child with a clubfoot became the subject of whispered prophecy. A prince with a high forehead and slow speech was said to be cursed. In a time before X-rays, MRIs, or even decent stethoscopes, a bad fever might be mistaken for demonic possession. And once a rumour started, especially in royal courts where information travelled faster than truth, it was almost impossible to erase. This is where it gets murky, because the very idea of royal blood, of sacred inheritance, made any flaw feel larger than life. If a commoner stumbled in the street, no one cared. If a king's eye twitched in the wrong direction, rumours of insanity spread across the continent. Monarchs weren't allowed to be human, and yet their entire system of marriage guaranteed they'd inherit every recessive gene in the family genome. It's like breeding racehorses for speed without checking for brittle bones. You peek into a royal physician's diary from the 18th century and find entries like, His Majesty exhibited signs of divine melancholy, and Her Royal Highness continues to suffer from vapours and an unquiet womb. These aren't just phrases, they're evasions. They were often used to describe epilepsy, depression, anxiety, reproductive disorders, or genetic conditions like Marfan syndrome or porphyria. But without the tools to understand them, physicians wrapped them in layers of noble-sounding vagueness and moved on. And then there's the matter of appearance. Royal portraits were never just art. They were PR. Monarchs were posed to emphasise strength, intelligence, symmetry. But now, centuries later, scholars are re-examining those portraits with medical eyes. Was that Habsburg jaw just artistic style, or an early depiction of the mandibular prognathism? Was that slight bulge in a prince's temple an indication of hydrocephalus? It's a strange, retrospective kind of diagnosis. Art history meets forensics. But here's the thing. Not every oddity was a symptom. Some kings were just weird. Some queens were just depressed, or tired, or suffocating under the weight of their role. The danger of looking at history through a purely medical lens is that you risk turning complex people into case studies. There's a fine line between understanding the genetic impacts of inbreeding and flattening entire lives into footnotes in a textbook on royal pathologies. Still, some signs are hard to ignore. Genetic conditions like hemophilia, for example, leave a paper trail you can't rewrite. Other conditions, though, like royal madness, remain open to interpretation. Was King George III truly suffering from porphyria, or was it severe bipolar disorder exacerbated by stress? Was Charles VI of France hallucinating due to schizophrenia, or was he slowly poisoned by mercury in his medicines? Here's your peculiar footnote for the night. In the 17th century, a French noblewoman wrote to her sister about the king's disordered humours, claiming that moonlight made his mind turn inward. She recommended cold compresses and fasting. Scholars now believe the king was epileptic. At the time, he was locked away and kept from windows. Because what else would you do when your king starts twitching under a full moon? And then, of course, there's the legacy of it all. Even today, royal families are haunted by the stories of their ancestors. Modern royals may be physically healthier thanks to marrying outside the cousin circuit, but the psychological pressure hasn't gone away. If anything, it's intensified. Every gesture, every illness, every stumble is recorded, dissected, spun. The world no longer believes in divine blood, but it still expects perfection. You exit this gallery of ghosts with a sense of unease. The truth about royal health, both physical and mental, was often distorted by myth, misdiagnosis, and propaganda. And yet somewhere in those dusty medical ledgers and anxious court letters lies the real cost of inbreeding. Not just in the visible damage, but in the silence it left behind. Because the greatest symptom of royal inbreeding might not have been deformity or disease, it was denial. And that, more than anything, kept the cycle spinning for centuries. You're walking through the present now, and it feels almost strange. No powdered wigs, no cousin weddings attended by 5 generations of the same uncles, just sleek suits, glossy press photos, and smiling royals waving at crowds that are half politely interested, half holding smartphones aloft like torches. But underneath the glossy PR and carefully curated Instagram accounts, you know the history, know how far they've come, and what they're trying very hard not to repeat. You're about to see how modern royals are testing, reshaping, and quietly rewriting the rules of their bloodlines. This is the moment when the gene pool finally gets some fresh water. You start in Britain, because of course you do. The Windsors are practically a brand now, but look close and you see something quietly radical happening. In 2011, Prince William married Catherine Middleton, not a princess, not a distant European duchess, a commoner, a well-educated middle-class woman with 0 ancestral castles, and the world didn't end, the monarchy didn't crumble, the press frothed with excitement, not outrage, because for the first time in a very long time, the question wasn't, is she of noble birth? It was, do they seem happy? But this wasn't just a PR move, it was biology too. After centuries of cousins marrying cousins, the British royal family had finally introduced real genetic distance. Catherine's bloodline doesn't double back on itself. Her grandparents weren't German dukes, they were coal miners and shopkeepers, the kind of people who didn't have to check a family tree before proposing. And when their children, George, Charlotte and Louis, were born, the public celebrated their arrival without once asking if they had hemophilia or a protruding jaw. It was assumed almost casually that they'd be healthy, because the royal family had, perhaps for the first time in modern history, done something truly brave. They'd married someone outside the club. And then came Harry and Meghan, a whole different kind of bombshell. Meghan Markle, divorced, biracial, American, an actress. It was the genetic and social equivalent of throwing a Molotov cocktail into the royal gene pool. The media reaction was telling. Not just racist, not just sexist, but shocked by her otherness. She wasn't from the world of breeding charts and palace protocols, and to some that was terrifying, but for others it was about time. The birth of their children, Archie and Lilibet, represented something unthinkable just a few generations ago. A royal lineage that looked like the actual modern world. And Britain isn't alone. In the past 30 years, almost every European royal family has moved away from intermarriage within the aristocracy. Crown Prince Haakon of Norway married Mette Marie, a single mother with a non-noble past. The people gasped, then applauded. Sweden's Crown Princess Victoria married Daniel Westling, a former gym trainer and commoner. Spain's King Felipe VI married Letizia Ortiz, a journalist and divorcee. The Dutch royal family broke barriers decades earlier when Princess Beatrix married Klaus von Habsburg. A German, yes, but not royalty. And when her son Willem Alexander married Maxima Zorreguieta from Argentina, the royal genome did a literal tango into the modern age. So what changed? Why, after centuries of carefully charted cousin weddings, did royal families suddenly open the doors? Well, for one, science. Genetic counselling is now a standard part of premarital assessments for royal couples. Before 2 heirs marry, there are quiet screenings done. Nothing mandatory, but quietly thorough. The old aristocratic assumption that all noble blood is good blood has been replaced by something a little more grounded. Blood is blood. It can carry risk. And the best way to avoid repeating the mistakes of your inbred ancestors is to not marry anyone with the same great-great-grandmother as you. Second, public pressure. Modern monarchies survive on approval ratings. They are no longer absolute rulers. They are constitutional figureheads, and their relevance depends on staying likeable. When the public sees a prince marry a common heir, it feels like progress, like the crown is something a little more human, a little more relatable. And when the result is 3 charming, healthy children waving from a palace balcony, that's worth more than any archaic title or ancient alliance. There's also the matter of survival. Some royal houses, especially in smaller countries, were simply running out of eligible cousins. You can't keep marrying within the same dozen families forever. And when you look at the previous century of royals who died young, had no heirs, or produced generations plagued by illness and instability, the logic becomes pretty clear. A diversified gene pool isn't just preferable, it's essential. Here's your odd but relevant fact. In the 2000s, a Spanish biologist studied the rate of inbreeding in historical royal families, and concluded that the average inbreeding coefficient among Habsburg monarchs was equivalent to what you'd see if 2 siblings had a child together. By comparison, today's European royal babies have no more genetic overlap than any 2 strangers on a train. That's how much things have shifted. The royal DNA has finally broken the loop. Of course, this doesn't mean the past is gone. The legacy of inbreeding still lingers in medical histories in the way modern royals speak, cautiously, always polished. But now you understand, they're not just trained to be formal. They're trained not to crack. The weight of history still sits on their shoulders. Every public appearance is a balancing act between tradition and survival, between we are just like you and we're still royal. It's a fine line, and they walk it in designer shoes with DNA-tested ankles. Some scholars see all this as a quiet revolution, a slow transformation from divine right to curated relevance. The blood may no longer be blue, but it's finally healthy. And in the end, what's more valuable? A 1,000-year-old title, or a child born without fear of inherited disease? You look at the newest generation of royals, and you don't see the echoes of Charles VI, or Alexei, or Victoria Eugenie. You see kids who can climb trees, scrape knees, and heal. You see faces that reflect more of the world than ever before. And that's not just progress, it's repair. This is what testing the gene pool looks like. Not just in labs or ancestry kits, but in palaces, in marriages, in choices. The royal families that survived didn't do so because their blood was purer. They survived because at long last they diluted it. You stand now at a strange crossroads, somewhere between velvet-lined tradition and DNA-tested pragmatism. Watching royal houses shed their ancestral skin like snakes slowly waking from hibernation. The age of blue blood purity is ending, and not with a revolution or a royal decree, but with a long, quiet sigh of collective relief. For centuries, monarchs clung to the idea that marrying someone outside the aristocracy was akin to diluting divinity, that your blood, if it was royal, was better, smarter, more refined, destined for greatness. But now you're watching that illusion finally fade. The end of blue blood purity is not a scandal anymore, it's a solution. And it's been a long time coming. You trace the beginning of the end not to one singular event, but to a slow, generational pivot. Royal advisors stopped drawing up marriage contracts with hand-inked family trees and started making room for, well, dating. Imagine that. A prince on a university campus, meeting a future queen in a shared seminar, or, if you believe the whispers, in a crowded bar. The heirs of Europe started falling in love not with archduchesses, but with journalists, commoners, actors, military officers. And when it worked, it worked. Their children were healthy, their families relatable, and the approval ratings? Through the roof. The tide had turned not just because of medicine or media pressure, but because the old model had simply stopped making sense. Cousin marriage was no longer a sign of prestige. It was a red flag, and public fascination shifted from noble bloodlines to fairy tale love stories. The commoner-turned-princess trope became its own genre. Magazines plastered at royal weddings with headlines like, "She's just like us," and "Modern love in the palace," a subtle nod to the fact that this wasn't about preserving dynasties anymore. It was about rebooting them. Still, the older generation didn't always embrace the change. You remember how Queen Elizabeth II, beloved as she was, reportedly raised eyebrows when her grandson Harry brought Meghan Markle into the family. Not just because Meghan was American or divorced, but because she didn't fit into any royal mould. She wasn't one of them. But what exactly did that mean anymore? By then, the monarchy had already abandoned the idea of blue blood in practice. Now they were just struggling to let go of the myth. And what a myth it was! For centuries, royalty clung to the belief that their blood made them different, superior. That by keeping their lines pure, they preserved something sacred. But genetics, you discover, doesn't care about your crest. It doesn't reward titles or crowns. If anything, it punishes repetition. The gene pool, when closed off for too long, begins to echo. The results, as you've seen, jaw deformities, infertility, mental illness, haemophilia, weren't curses, they were consequences. You think back to Charles II of Spain, to his enormous jaw and childless marriage. To Alexei, unable to walk downstairs without risking death. To generations of royal children buried without names, all of it in the name of purity. And what did it bring them? Power, for a time, but fragility in the end. An empire can survive war, invasion, even revolution, but it can't survive a family tree with nowhere left to branch. Here's a strange and telling anecdote. When Prince Charles, now King Charles III, was younger, his name was floated as a potential match for numerous European princesses, classic cousin pairing prospects. But eventually he married Diana Spencer, a noblewoman, yes, but not royal. That at the time felt like a slight modernisation. The match still didn't last, of course, but what followed? Camilla, a divorced commoner. Kate Middleton, a college sweetheart. Meghan Markle, the global curveball. These weren't just deviations. They were rejections of the old rulebook. And even with the drama the institution held, scholars often say that monarchies survive by evolving. And while that might sound like PR fluff, you see the truth in it. The royal families that have lasted, Britain, the Scandinavian houses, the Dutch, the Spanish, they've survived not because they were stubborn about tradition, but because they started choosing their partners with their hearts and their heads. Not a single one of them now insists on cousin marriages. Not a single one mandates noble blood. The fairy tale has changed its rules. You notice it in the way royal children are raised today too. There's no hiding them away, no pressure to project divine perfection. Prince George and Princess Charlotte attend school with commoners. They're seen having tantrums in public, making silly faces, being kids. There's no need to pretend they're gods, they're people. And that shift, subtle but seismic, is a death knell to blue blood purity. The myth doesn't need to be shattered in a single speech. It just needs to be replaced with something real. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In a 2021 interview, a European royal off the record admitted that genetic testing was quietly done for several family members before a recent marriage was approved, not to preserve purity, but to prevent another hereditary disorder. In other words, they finally learned the lesson Charles II never could. Sometimes the best thing a monarch can do for the future of their house is marry someone with completely unrelated DNA. So what are we left with? Not divine right, not sacred blood, but maybe something better, a royal lineage that survives because it adapts. The end of blue blood purity doesn't mean the end of monarchy. It means monarchy finally looks human, fallible, modern, and maybe, just maybe, worth paying attention to again. You leave this section with a strange feeling like waking from a long dream. The castles are still there, the carriages still shine, but inside the palace walls the rules have changed. Love has replaced lineage, health has replaced heraldry, and the next heir to the throne, he probably won't marry his cousin. He'll meet someone in a lecture hall or a charity event, and the only thing he'll be checking is whether they laugh at the same bad jokes. You've met the doomed ones, the bleeding princes, the jaw-locked kings, the scandal-skirting queens. But tonight, let's dim the lights and take a quieter path. You're here to meet the survivors, the outliers, the royals who, despite the odds, the cousin weddings, the mysterious seizures and whisper-thick bloodlines, somehow turned out fine, even healthy. Not every child of inbreeding was born doomed to limp to an early grave. And in a way, their existence is just as shocking as the tragedies, because it forces you to ask, how did they get away with it? You begin in Austria again, of all places. It's like returning to the scene of 100 genetic crimes. But here comes a familiar face, Emperor Franz Joseph I Habsburg. The chin, still present. The pedigree, incredibly tangled. And yet, He lives into his 80s, rules for nearly 70 years, and remains mentally sharp well into his twilight. He's strict, formal, emotionally stunted, but he doesn't collapse in a puddle of chromosomes like so many of his relatives. His marriage to Elizabeth of Bavaria is famously miserable, but genetically, not catastrophic. Their children don't glow with health exactly, but they don't crumble either. It's almost suspicious, and Franz Joseph isn't the only one. You drift into the courts of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Victoria's extended brood, and meet Edward VII, her eldest son. Born from a cousin marriage, part of the infamous hemophilia-sprouting Windsor line. And yet he doesn't have it. He lives to 68, smokes like a chimney, eats like a duke with no cholesterol, and famously, very famously, indulges in a rather vigorous social life. The fact that he didn't keel over from gout and shame by age 40 is a marvel. And genetically, his son George V also comes out sturdy. No mental illness, no bleeding, just a stiff upper lip and 2 functional lungs. You start to see a pattern that doesn't quite fit the cautionary tale. These families were playing with fire. Yes, but sometimes the house didn't burn. Why? Modern scientists suggest a few possibilities. First, genetics is a numbers game. Inbreeding increases the chances of recessive disorders, but doesn't guarantee them. It's a probability dice roll. You can have a heavily inbred child who inherits only the good genes, purely by chance. They dodge the faulty pairings, they get lucky. Second, the survivors may have had the benefit of early medical intervention. Even in the 19th century, certain conditions could be managed, if not cured, then soothed. A young prince with asthma, for example, might have been kept alive thanks to modernising medicine, clean diets and clean diets, and endless resources. A haemophilia carrier might live her whole life without knowing it, simply because she never had sons or never got injured. It's not miracle, it's controlled circumstance. But here's where it gets weirder. Some scholars argue that the royal obsession with resilient blood may have accidentally selected for certain health traits over time. After all, the children who survived were often the ones most celebrated, most likely to marry, most likely to pass on their genes. So what if, among the doom and gloom, there was a low-key Darwinian filtering effect happening? Not exactly natural selection, but noble selection. A subtle tilt towards survivability, even within a shallow gene pool. It's an uncomfortable theory, but you can't ignore the evidence. Queen Elizabeth II, for instance, descendant of Queen Victoria, connected by blood to nearly every royal house in Europe, lived to 96. Her husband, Prince Philip, also from a heavily intermarried family, lived to 99. Were there exceptions? Yes. But maybe not flukes. Maybe after generations of biological disasters, the gene pool had finally started to shake itself out, like a washing machine after a long, loud spin cycle. And here's your fringe fact. Some modern geneticists have looked at mitochondrial DNA, the stuff passed down from mother to child, and found unexpected robustness in certain royal lines. Victoria, for all her genetic baggage, may have had unusually strong mitochondrial genes, which are linked to cellular energy production. So even while passing on the X-linked haemophilia mutation, she may have also passed on a kind of biological shield that helped other descendants weather the load. The idea that you can inherit resilience alongside risk is something science is only starting to explore. Still, not all of these survivors made it out entirely unscathed. Many showed signs of what we'd now call neurodivergence, or emotional repression, or anxiety masked by decorum. You look at Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, and see a man of brilliant intellect and fragile nerves. He functioned, he even thrived, but he carried shadows too. Others, like Princess Alice of Battenberg, Prince Philip's mother, struggled with schizophrenia. Her story is one of resilience and suffering, a reminder that survival doesn't always mean untouched. The deeper you look, the more nuanced the picture becomes. Yes, some royal descendants broke free of the genetic trap, but many did so with scars, visible or not. They lived long lives, but often under immense pressure, carrying titles that came with expectations as suffocating as their family trees. The legacy of inbreeding didn't just vanish. It lingered, tucked behind stoic expressions concealed in archives, sometimes whispered about at dinner parties where cousins still married each other, just slightly further down the branch. And yet for all this, you can't help but feel a flicker of awe. These survivors weren't just statistical anomalies, they were dynastic redemption arcs. proof that somehow not every royal child born into a genetic labyrinth was doomed to wander it forever. Some emerged with clear eyes, strong hearts, and remarkably functional immune systems. They weren't divine, but they weren't disasters either. They were human, and that, in the end, is perhaps the greatest plot twist of all. You step back now, out of the nursery, out of the portraits, and look across centuries of royal lineage. The pain is still there, the tragic stories still echo, but somewhere between the hemophiliac Tsarevich and the long-reigning queen, something shifted. Not everything broke. Some pieces held, and from those pieces, the modern monarchy began to rebuild, not on purity but on persistence. The map unrolls beneath your feet now, and it stretches far beyond the familiar castles of Europe. Tonight, you're stepping outside the Western narrative, away from Versailles and Windsor and Vienna, and into places where royalty wore feathers or gold-threaded robes instead of ermine capes. Because the story of royal inbreeding, this grand experiment in political biology, isn't exclusive to Europe. You're about to discover that cousin marriage, bloodline preservation, and the haunting consequences of closed genetic loops existed in many corners of the world. The motivations were different, the rituals more varied, but the results, often just as eerie. Your first stop is the Inca Empire, high in the Andes, where the Sapa Inca, the emperor, was considered divine. Not metaphorically, he was literally a god on earth, descended from the sun itself. And when your blood is that sacred, you don't just marry any old noble, you marry your sister. That's right, full sister. Brother-sister marriage wasn't an exception among Inca royalty. It was policy. The reasoning? To keep the blood of the sun pure and the imperial throne uncontested. Outsiders would taint the divine lineage. And when you believe your ruler is semi-celestial, what's a little familial overlap? But even gods have livers, and bones, and DNA. Modern studies of skeletal remains from Incan royal tombs suggest signs of chronic illness and possibly genetic disorders among elites. And though the Spanish obliterated much of Incan culture, early accounts from conquistadors described emperors who died young or showed signs of physical fragility, short stature, frailty, or unexplained weakness. Whether this was the result of inbreeding is debated, but the pattern matches what we've seen before: a divine bloodline, tightly controlled, slowly eroding from within. You drift over to the ancient Hawaiian kingdom next, where the alii, the ruling class, also believed in divine descent. Here too, sibling marriage was not just permitted, but sometimes required. The highest-ranking marriages were between full siblings, believed to produce children with the most mana or spiritual power. These children were sacred from birth, seen as living embodiments of the gods. It's the same logic echoed on the other side of the world. If you want to maintain divine authority, you marry your own. The most famous example? Kamehameha II's court, where intra-family unions were strategic, spiritual and political all at once. But as missionaries and Western influence arrived, these customs were slowly stamped out. The practice faded before genetic consequences could become fully visible. But anthropologists still debate what might have occurred had the tradition continued another few generations. And then there's ancient Egypt. Yes, again, because while we've already visited Tutankhamun's tragic saga, the practice of royal sibling marriage spanned millennia in that region. But it wasn't just the pharaohs. Ptolemaic rulers, including Cleopatra VII herself, were still marrying their siblings 300 years before the birth of Christ. Cleopatra married two of her brothers. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was the result of multiple cousin marriages. The Ptolemies were Greek in origin, ruling over an Egyptian kingdom, and they adopted the tradition of intra-family marriage as both homage and insurance policy. The result? A family tree that makes a pretzel look relaxed. Historical accounts describe Ptolemaic rulers with temperaments ranging from eerily calm to violently paranoid. Some scholars believe the dynasty's infamous instability, its murders, poisonings, and inter-family betrayals, may have been more than just politics. The closed gene pool might have contributed to increased instances of mental illness, personality disorders, and cognitive decline. But because records are sparse and propaganda thick, much remains speculative. Now you slide across the globe to Imperial China. Here, royal incest wasn't practiced quite the same way. First cousins and siblings were typically off limits, according to Confucian principles, which emphasised clear separation between family lines. But that didn't mean the gene pool was diverse. Chinese emperors frequently took wives and concubines from the same handful of noble families, over and over again. So while they weren't marrying their sisters, they were still drawing from a very limited pool. And after a few centuries of repeating this, the result wasn't pretty. Case in point, the Ming dynasty, where inbreeding wasn't open policy, but it quietly bloomed anyway. The emperors of the late Ming period suffered from various health issues: poor eyesight, stunted growth, early deaths. One emperor died in his 20s after years of declining health that no physician could quite explain. Another became so erratic and reclusive that ministers wrote increasingly desperate letters begging him to appear in court. While it's difficult to prove direct genetic causes in these cases, the signs match a pattern you've now seen across continents. Royalty trying to protect its purity and slowly choking itself in the process. In the Islamic world, cousin marriage was, and still is, common in certain regions, though not necessarily among royals exclusively. The practice stems more from cultural and tribal traditions than a belief in divine bloodlines. That said, royal houses like the Abbasids, the Mughals, and the Safavids frequently married cousins to maintain alliances within elite families. While this didn't always lead to visible inbreeding disorders, over time certain dynasties showed signs of decline associated with limited genetic variants, most notably infertility, sudden deaths among heirs, and mental instability. What unites these global dynasties isn't the exact method, but the mindset. Whether in Hawaii or Peru, Egypt or Persia, the idea of pure blood always translated to insularity. Royalty became a closed loop, whether justified by religion, politics, or cosmic mandate, and inevitably the loop tightened too far. Here's your odd little fact. Among the Zulu kings of South Africa, marriages were typically poly but deliberately diversified. A king might have dozens of wives from different clans, ensuring his children were genetically varied and politically useful. It's a rare example of a monarchy expanding its bloodline instead of restricting it, and maybe that's part of the reason the Zulu royal family still exists today, with far fewer whispers of deformity or decline. You pause here, gazing across the global timeline, and realise this isn't just a European tragedy. It's a human one. Power, wherever it concentrates, tends to fear dilution. It wraps itself in ritual, myth, and marriage contracts, hoping to seal itself from change. But biology doesn't care about crowns, or sacred mountains, or ancient blood. It simply responds to what it's given, and when it's given the same ingredients, over and over again, it begins to fold in on itself. So yes, Europe wrote many chapters of the royal inbreeding saga, but it was never the only author. From the Andes to Alexandria, from Kyoto to Kampala, the same story played out again and again. Keep it in the family and hope the family holds. You've followed the trails of royal bloodlines through glittering palaces, crumbling dynasties, and scientific side alleys. Now, it's time to talk about the people who did the unthinkable. They warned them, yes, before genetic counselling existed. Before you could send your saliva off in the mail to see which side of your family gave you your weird earlobes, there were already voices whispering that something wasn't right. Advisors, doctors, courtiers, people who saw the pattern and tried, in their own careful ways, to break the cycle. This is the part of the story where realism tried to tap on the palace window. Usually it got ignored. Sometimes it got pushed off the balcony. You meet your first would-be reformer in the early 18th century, inside the glistening halls of Vienna. His name isn't in the usual royal histories because he wasn't royal. He was a court physician, meticulous, observant, and increasingly alarmed by what he saw in the Habsburg nurseries. Infants with club feet, toddlers who couldn't speak, stillbirths with deformities hidden under crisp white sheets before anyone outside the palace could glimpse them. In his private notes, he questioned the close familial marriages. Not publicly, of course, that would be suicide, but he began quietly advising noble families to seek more genetically diverse matches. His words were ignored. The next Habsburg heir was a double cousin. You see the same thing happening a century later in Britain. Queen Victoria's own doctors eventually realised something was off. Too many of her descendants were dying from minor injuries, too many of her daughters were carriers of an unnamed curse. By the late 1800s, several medical advisors had pieced together the idea that the disease, what we now call hemophilia, was inherited. One even suggested that marrying into fresh stock might prevent further cases. But telling a queen she's passing on a deadly gene, not exactly a great career move. Even when physicians did raise alarms, they were often dismissed by royal advisors who cared far more about the appearance of strength than actual health. You wander through the Spanish court in the 17th century and see a similar situation. Charles II's grotesque decline was plain to everyone, but no one dared suggest that his parentage might be to blame. The Habsburg jaw was seen as a symbol of dynasty, not disorder, a badge of legitimacy, even as it made speech and chewing increasingly difficult. Sometimes the warnings came from inside the royal family. You imagine a young noblewoman, educated, sceptical, frustrated, writing to her sister in another court. "They have paired me with our cousin again. He stammers and cannot remember his catechism. I do not wish to bear such children." Letters like this exist, mostly buried in archives, filled with veiled complaints and euphemisms. One 18th century German princess wrote of her husband-to-be, "He is kind but dull in eye and expression. The blood is too thick here." And it wasn't just anecdotal. As early as the 19th century, small groups of scientists began to formalise their observations. The emerging field of heredity was starting to question the wisdom of close familial marriage. Gregor Mendel, the monk who famously studied pea plants, was publishing work that suggested traits could be predicted, inherited, and sometimes corrupted by repetition. He worked in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, just a few hundred miles from Habsburg territory, but you better believe no royal was reading that while drawing up marriage contracts. Later in the early 20th century, as eugenics entered the scientific mainstream, yes, the problematic parts too, new voices joined the chorus of concern. Some of it came from the wrong angle, obsessed with racial purity and class superiority. But even within that dark stew, there were those who simply noted, with growing clarity, that cousin marriage increased the risk of recessive genetic disorders. By the 1920s, countries like the United States, Germany and Britain were conducting population-wide studies on consanguinity and its biological effects. And yet, royal houses kept marrying within the same bloodlines. Why? Because power, ultimately, has always outranked science, and for many royal advisors the risks were seen as acceptable if it meant preserving alliances, consolidating land and keeping foreign influence at bay. You see a letter from a British advisor in the 30s lamenting that young royals were now too liberal with their hearts. Translation? They were dating people without titles. Horrifying. Even as the evidence mounted, the instinct to protect tradition, to shield the royal image, remained stronger than the instinct to protect the people within it. Here's your peculiar fringe fact. In the early 1900s, a minor nobleman in the Austro-Hungarian Empire started compiling a private dysfunction ledger of royal families. He noted symptoms, marriages, illnesses, and causes of death across 5 generations. The conclusion? He believed the Habsburg line was reaching its natural end, not politically but biologically. He showed it to a local doctor, who agreed. The book was confiscated within weeks, and the nobleman was quietly disinvited from all court events for the rest of his life. In modern times, the warnings finally turned into policy. Today, royal families, particularly in Europe, often consult genetic counsellors before marriages. The concern isn't public scandal anymore, it's preventative care. And while they don't advertise these medical screenings, they exist. It's standard protocol now for royal newborns to undergo early health assessments, not just for show, but for peace of mind. It's what happens when an institution finally starts listening to the people who used to be ignored. Still, scholars debate when the true turning point happened. Some say it was the birth of the last hemophiliac heir. Others argue it was Edward VIII's abdication, where romance officially beat out royal utility. But maybe it wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was the slow accumulation of ignored warnings, ghost children, and exhausted doctors that finally cracked the marble walls. The evidence was always there. It just took centuries for someone to believe it mattered more than a title. You step now into the shoes of those forgotten advisors, the court physicians, the governesses, the whispering mothers, who saw what was coming and tried to nudge the future in a safer direction. Most failed, some were mocked, a few were punished, but in the long run they were right. The real nobility wasn't in bloodlines, it was in the willingness to tell the truth. There's a moment you've probably been expecting, a kind of cinematic wide-angle shot where we step back and look at the whole thing, the castles, the bloodlines, the doomed children, the jawlines that could cut glass, and above all the mythology. Because that's what royal inbreeding always came down to, right? Myth. The illusion of purity, the fantasy that some blood is better than other blood. That divine right can be encoded in your DNA. Tonight we're peeling that back, carefully, like lifting velvet from an old mirror. And what we're left with isn't just biology, it's belief. Royalty, at its core, has always depended on people believing that monarchs are different. Not just richer, not just more powerful, but inherently spiritually, biologically elevated. The divine right of kings wasn't just a theological argument, it was a eugenic one before eugenics had a name. If a king ruled because God wanted him to, then his blood had to be sacred, and if his blood was sacred, it had to be protected. You don't pour holy water into just any vessel, right? So what do? You keep it close. You marry your cousin, your niece, your sister. You protect that sacred bloodline the way a collector protects a rare wine, by sealing it, over and over, and like wine, it eventually spoils. But the myth of divine blood endured, even as the people bleeding it were breaking. Charles II of Spain was barely functional. Prince Alexei of Russia lived in constant agony. Countless unnamed heirs were still born or deformed, and yet no one said the words out loud. This is what happens when you only marry people who look like your reflection. Instead, they said divine will, the burdens of royalty, God's mysterious plan, anything but the truth. You see, it wasn't just about power, it was about fear. Fear that if the myth broke, if people stopped believing royal blood was special, the entire system would unravel. Because what separates a king from a banker if not divine ancestry? What makes a queen more worthy than a schoolteacher if not the blood in her veins? The illusion had to be preserved, even at the cost of real human suffering. You can almost hear the unspoken prayer running beneath centuries of royal tradition. Let the blood stay pure. Let the child be whole. Let the name continue, unbroken. And when that prayer failed, as it so often did, there was silence. Or worse, excuses. Heirs were hidden, conditions were renamed. Madness became melancholia, bleeding became delicate constitution. Genetic collapse became God's punishment, or fate, or mystery. But deep down, you know what it was. It was the price of a lie. The tragedy is that the myth endured long after its usefulness. Even as science advanced, even as doctors warned against cousin marriage, even as the royal houses began to fracture, still, the idea of noble blood had power. It was in the way newspapers fawned over royal babies, the way engagement announcements still mention ancestral titles, the way fans, even now, talk about royal children like they carry magic. And here's your peculiar detail for tonight. In 2020, a poll in the UK found that nearly 30% of respondents believed the British royal family possessed superior genetics to the general population. Superior. After everything. After centuries of haemophilia, infertility, miscarriages and jaws that required special cutlery. That belief, quiet, casual, persistent, is what kept this whole machine going. Not just the royals themselves, but the people who believed in them. That's why royal inbreeding isn't just a cautionary tale about biology. It's a cautionary tale about story. About what happens when a society builds its hierarchy on a fiction and then refuses to rewrite it, even as the evidence screams from every cradle and grave. The myth becomes a trap, and the people inside, those born with crowns already on their heads, don't escape either. They just bleed more privately. You picture a young princess in 1890 pacing her room after a miscarriage. She's married to her cousin. She's read the family histories. She's seen the portraits of twisted limbs and hollow eyes, but she's told to keep trying, because her duty is to bear heirs, not to ask questions. Somewhere in her heart she knows something is broken, but she smiles and tries again. You think of a modern-day royal child born with perfect health, no known defects, no signs of inherited illness. The newspapers coo, the fans exhale. Thank God, someone mutters. But why was there worry in the first place? Because the story still lingers, the myth still echoes. Even in its twilight, royal blood remains charged. Every time a prince marries a commoner, it's framed as a break in tradition, not just socially, but genetically, as though marrying someone without noble ancestors is a risk. But let's be honest, it's the opposite. It's repair. The myth of blue blood has outlived its use. It served empires. justified wars, arranged loveless marriages, buried sick children. But now we have something better than myth. We have understanding. We know how recessive genes work. We know how to screen for disorders. We know that no one's day is sacred. And that's the beginning of something royal families never had before. Choice. The choice to marry for love. The choice to step outside tradition. The choice to break the loop. You look across the royal families of today, blended, modern, genetically diverse, and realise something surprising. They are still here. The castles haven't collapsed. The crowns haven't melted. In fact, the monarchies that abandoned the myth of blood purity are the ones that survived. Not because they clung to sacred blood, but because they let it go. So maybe the final chapter isn't tragedy, maybe it's transition. From divine right to DNA awareness, from secrecy to science, from bleeding in silence to building something better. The myth is dying, but that doesn't mean the story has to end. It just means that the next part will be written by humans, not gods. So now here you are, at the very end of the bloodline, or at least the story we've been tracing through every palace hallway, burial crypt and tragic nursery. You've seen crowns forged and fractured, dynasties rise and rot from the inside out. And if there's one thread tying all this together, one lesson that history whispers behind all the gold leaf and ceremonial trumpets, it's this. No amount of silk, no scroll of divine ancestry, no carefully inked family tree will protect you from biology. Royal or not, your genes don't care about your title. Let's walk back through it, just once more. It started with the idea that royal blood was different, holier, chosen. And from that belief bloomed centuries of self-contained unions, sealed off from the rest of the world like a Tupperware container left too long in the fridge. First cousins, second cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters, loop after loop until the royal family tree stopped branching and started coiling into itself. Generation after generation, the risk compounded. It wasn't instant doom, it was erosion, a slow, patient collapse. And still they believed. They married strategically, they drew bloodlines like maps, and when the signs began to show, children who couldn't walk, who couldn't speak, who couldn't survive beyond infancy, they buried them quietly, made up terms and polished the myth. They called it God's will, fate, or the cost of greatness. They never called it what it was, a genetic time bomb ticking softly in the nursery. The portraits are still hanging. You've seen them, those famous faces with regal bearing and uncanny symmetry, hiding hidden conditions beneath powdered skin and stoic eyes. Charles II, whose body was a patchwork of every Habsburg marriage before him. Alexei, the bleeding Tsarevich, the jawlines, the seizures, the lineages that ended not with war but with children too sick to produce heirs of their own. And what makes it even stranger, more heartbreaking, is that most of it wasn't malicious. It wasn't evil. It was ignorance wearing a crown, a belief passed down like a royal brooch, too sacred to question. They weren't trying to create tragedy. They were trying to preserve greatness. They just didn't know what that kind of preservation would cost. Even when the science finally caught up, when physicians began noticing the patterns, even as early theories of heredity took shape, the inertia of tradition was too strong. Monarchies weren't built for rapid change. They were built to repeat. And by the time anyone had the vocabulary to say recessive disorder, the damage was generational. But then something shifted. The modern age brought questions, cameras, scandals, a public that no longer worshipped royalty but judged it, sometimes harshly, sometimes with fascination. And one by one the walls began to crumble. Royals started marrying outside the gene pool. First it was seen as rebellion, then romantic, and now just normal. The bloodlines thinned in the best way possible. Not diluted, but oxygenated. New DNA flowed in. Journalists, military officers, commoners with the grandparents who worked in grocery stores. The result? Healthier heirs. Fewer hidden illnesses, fewer shadows behind the palace nursery doors. And here's the most unexpected twist of all. The monarchies that broke the purity myth didn't die. They endured. They grew stronger. Because it turns out people will still respect a crown even if the person wearing it isn't genetically entangled with every other European royal since Charlemagne. The myth wasn't necessary. It never was. So now, when a modern royal baby is born, the headlines don't speculate about bleeding disorders or whether the parents share a grandfather. They count fingers and toes, comment on the cheekbones, maybe analyse the name for hints of tradition. But behind it all, there's a quiet relief. The age of cousin marriage is over. The new bloodlines are open, healthier, human, and that brings us full circle. Because maybe the real shocking truth about royal inbreeding isn't how widespread it was, or how many lives it damaged, but how long it took to stop. Not just because of ignorance, but because of belief. It was belief that kept the system alive. That told queens to marry their uncles, that told emperors they were gods, and gods don't need genetic counselling. But the truth was always waiting in the background, in the biology, in the bodies of the children born too fragile to rule. And now that truth is finally visible, named, studied, prevented. The fairy tale didn't need to end. It just needed editing. Now the palaces remain, but they echo a little differently. Less like divine chambers, more like historic homes with very expensive plumbing. The crowns still glint, but they rest on heads that are fully human. And in some far corner of Europe, another royal child takes a first step across a polished floor, not knowing that centuries of myth were peeled back so they could walk without bleeding. That's the end of the line, not with a throne crumbling into dust, but with a child who may one day sit on one without the weight of centuries pressing down on their bones. The myth has cracked, the mirror has cleared, and at last, the royal face looking back is simply human. So here we are, at the soft landing of a long, strange tale. The lights have dimmed, the portraits have faded into shadow. The royal bloodlines, with all their twists and tangled roots, have led us back to something that feels unexpectedly simple. Biology wins. Always. No matter how many titles you inherit or how many crowns rest on your ancestors' heads, your DNA doesn't care. It remembers every choice made in secret chambers and candlelit ceremonies, every cousin match, every silent burial, every name that never made it into the history books. But it also remembers the course correction, the slow, creaky pivot from pure to healthy, from divine to real. And maybe, just maybe, that's the more powerful legacy. Tonight, as you drift off, maybe picture one of those old royal nurseries. Only now the child inside is healthy, whole, and unburdened. No looming fate, no inherited curse. Just a kid with 10 fingers, a giggle, and maybe a plastic crown on their head. The myth is gone, but the story continues. And that's the beauty of history, right? It isn't stuck, it moves, it learns. Even when the palaces are slow to change, time always presses forward, one generation at a time. So if you're still awake, take a moment to stretch, maybe sip some water, close your eyes, and let this story settle like dust in a royal corridor. You've walked through centuries tonight. You've survived empires, secret births, and more cousin marriages than anyone should have to endure. Sleep well, knowing that even the most gilded lies eventually give way to truth. And sometimes that truth looks a lot like progress.